The world of organized crime has always carried a magnetic, almost hypnotic allure. Tales of cunning, power, and audacity seem to echo through history, drawing listeners into a realm where lawlessness reigns but strategy and wit dictate survival. One of the most infamous crimes of the 20th century, the Lufthansa Heist, stands as a testament to the extremes of human ambition and the perils of greed. It is a story of meticulous planning, ruthless execution, and the deadly aftermath that claimed many of the very people who orchestrated it. The Lufthansa Heist was not just a robbery, it was a bold statement, a defining moment in the criminal underworld of New York during the late 1970s, capturing the imagination of the public and immortalized in cinematic history through the story of the Goodfellas in the late 1970s. John Gotti, Paul Vario, Henry Hill, and their associates were part of a sprawling network of mobsters whose reach extended across the city. The Laquis crime family, one of the 5 families that dominated organized crime in New York, had long maintained control over various illegal enterprises, including loan sharking, gambling, and extortion. Within this intricate web of criminal activity, some members were bold enough to conceive a plan that would eclipse every other heist in the city's history. The target was Lufthansa cargo at JFK Airport, a place where millions of dollars in cash and valuables were transported with routine precision. While most thieves would balk at the complexity and risk, these men saw opportunity. An opportunity in their world was worth taking at any cost. The planning of the Lufthansa heist was a masterclass in precision. Every detail had to be considered, from timing the arrival of cargo to understanding the security protocols and personnel involved. Inside sources were critical, and the crew leveraged relationships cultivated over years within the criminal world. Informants and insiders at the airport provided information that allowed the mobsters to know exactly when and where the cash shipments would arrive. They learned that at the height of holiday seasons, especially around Christmas, Lufthansa transported enormous amounts of currency to and from Germany. The cash was often in high denominations, easily transported in crates and boxes. To the planners, this was the perfect storm: enormous cash, minimal oversight, a routine schedule that could be exploited. Henry Hill, one of the key figures in the heist, played a central role in orchestrating the operation. He and his associates meticulously studied the airport's layout, identifying security checkpoints, guard routines, and cargo handling schedules. The heist required more than just brute force. It required the synchronization of multiple moving parts. Trucks had to arrive at precise moments, crew members had to know exactly which crates contained the cash, and timing was everything. Every mistake could mean capture or death. The team rehearsed their plan repeatedly, understanding that the line between success and failure was razor thin. Each participant had a defined role, from the men who would physically seize the money to those who would act as lookouts and drivers, ready to whisk away the spoils. The night of the heist, December 11th, 1978, was marked by a mixture of tension and calm determination. The crew knew that once they began, there was no turning back. As the Lufthansa cargo trucks pulled into the designated area at JFK Airport, the mobsters moved with quiet efficiency. Armed but disciplined, they overpowered the small number of guards, forcing compliance without unnecessary violence, though the threat of force was ever present. Crates of cash were loaded into waiting vehicles, the operation executed in mere minutes. It was a clean robbery in terms of execution, but the magnitude of the crime sent shockwaves throughout New York's underworld. Over $6 million in cash, along with jewelry valued at close to $1 million, had been taken. For that moment, the crew had achieved what many thought impossible, but the euphoria of success was fleeting. In the world of organized crime, theft is only part of the story. The aftermath is often more dangerous than the act itself. The Lufthansa heist created a domino effect of suspicion, paranoia, and betrayal. Many who had been directly or indirectly involved became targets themselves. The mob, with its code of silence and unyielding rules, demanded loyalty and secrecy, and any perceived threat to that secrecy was met with lethal consequences. Over the next months and years, several individuals connected to the heist disappeared under mysterious circumstances. Some were murdered, others vanished without a trace, leaving only whispers of their fate. The crime had been successful, but the cost was measured not in dollars but in lives. The story of the Lufthansa heist also illustrates the complex relationship between law enforcement and organized crime. Federal agencies, including the FBI, were quick to investigate, but the layers of secrecy, intimidation, and insider knowledge made prosecution extremely challenging. Witnesses were reluctant to testify, fearing retribution, and evidence was often scarce or circumstantial. The heist became emblematic of the cat-and-mouse game between the mob and law enforcement, a game defined by patience, strategy, and the constant threat of violence. In the decades that followed, the heist remained one of the most talked-about crimes in American history, symbolizing both the ingenuity and the recklessness of the people who lived by the mob's code. Beyond the money, the Lufthansa heist holds a place in cultural memory. Its depiction in the film Goodfellas brought the story to a global audience, dramatizing not only the robbery itself, but the personalities, ambitions, and flaws of those involved. It is a story that resonates because it captures the human dimensions of crime, greed, loyalty, fear, and the constant interplay between risk and reward. The characters are not merely criminals. They are complex individuals navigating a dangerous world where every decision carries weight and every action has consequences. For those listening in the quiet of night, it is a story that unfolds like a dark lullaby, simultaneously thrilling and cautionary. The Lufthansa heist reminds us that crime is rarely glamorous, no matter how romanticized in movies or books. It is a calculated gamble, a high-stakes endeavor where the rewards are immense but the risks are often fatal. The men who executed it were brilliant in their planning, audacious in their actions, and ultimately tragic in their fates. Their story endures not just as a tale of theft, but as a meditation on ambition, morality, and the precarious nature of power. In the stillness of night, one can almost hear the echo of that December evening at JFK Airport, the footsteps, whispered commands, the clatter of crates, and the fleeting triumph before the inevitable consequences set in. It is this mixture of tension, intellect, and human drama that makes the Lufthansa heist an unforgettable chapter in the annals of organized crime, a story to be told, remembered, and reflected upon. The aftermath of the Lufthansa heist was as perilous as the heist itself, though in a far more insidious way. The initial triumph, the adrenaline of executing one of the largest cash robberies in American history, quickly gave way to fear, suspicion, and paranoia. In the world of organized crime, success breeds scrutiny, and the more audacious the crime, the sharper the spotlight on everyone involved. The men who had celebrated their victory were suddenly confronted with a new reality, a world where loyalty was fragile, information was currency, and every friend could potentially become an enemy. The $6 million in cash, though staggering in sum, brought consequences far heavier than the weight of the crates themselves. Henry Hill, who had been central to the heist's planning and execution, quickly learned that in the mob, silence is not only golden, it is life-saving. While the crew had pulled off the robbery with remarkable efficiency, the attention it drew from law enforcement and rival criminals alike was immense. The FBI launched a full-scale investigation, deploying agents to piece together what little evidence they could find. Witnesses were intimidated, associates became nervous, and the hierarchy within the Lucky's crime family grew anxious. Every detail of the heist had to be accounted for: who knew what, who had touched the money, and most importantly, who could potentially talk. Within weeks, the dynamics of trust began to shift, and the celebratory atmosphere that had followed the heist began to dissolve under the heavy cloud of fear. In those early days after the robbery, distribution of the loot became a critical concern. The money could not simply sit in one place, nor could it remain unaccounted for. The mob had established systems for laundering cash through gambling operations, nightclubs, and legitimate businesses, but the scale of the Lufthansa heist posed a challenge. Splitting millions of dollars required precision and discretion. Every transaction carried risk, and the smallest misstep could attract attention from law enforcement or rival factions within the underworld. For Henry Hill and his associates, this was the moment when the high of the robbery collided with the harsh realities of organized crime. Planning and execution were one thing, surviving the aftermath was another entirely. As the weeks passed, a pattern emerged that would come to define the tragic consequences of the heist. Members of the crew who had direct knowledge of the robbery began to disappear, often under mysterious circumstances. Some were found dead, their bodies a grim reminder of the cost of crossing, or even simply knowing too much. The mob's code of conduct dictated that any potential threat to secrecy, no matter how small, had to be eliminated. Fear became a tool as effective as any weapon, and suspicion infected every interaction. Friends became wary, casual conversations were scrutinized for hidden meanings, and loyalty was continually tested. The very act that had brought them wealth and prestige now placed them squarely in the crosshairs of both the law and their criminal peers. Henry Hill himself lived in a constant state of tension, acutely aware that knowledge was both his greatest asset and his greatest liability. He had seen firsthand how quickly associates could vanish, and he knew that any misstep could lead to the same fate. Yet, he also understood the importance of maintaining composure. To survive, he had to balance visibility and discretion, participating in daily mob activities while avoiding drawing unnecessary attention. This delicate balancing act defined his existence in the months following the heist. Every decision, every interaction carried weight. The once glorious success of December 11, 1978, became overshadowed by a pervasive sense of dread, a stark reminder that in the underworld, triumph and tragedy often walk hand in hand. The law enforcement response intensified as the investigation unfolded. Federal agents meticulously reconstructed the events leading up to the heist, tracing contacts, movements, and communications with painstaking care. The mob's code of silence omerta was formidable, yet the scale of the robbery meant that cracks were inevitable. Informants and small-time associates were pressured into cooperating, and rumors circulated throughout the criminal community. The investigation was methodical and relentless, underscoring the stark reality that in the modern age of policing, even the most carefully planned crimes could not escape scrutiny indefinitely. For the Lufthansa Heist Crew, this meant that every day was a high-stakes negotiation with fate. Despite the looming threats, the allure of wealth and power remained irresistible. Members of the crew sought to enjoy their newfound fortunes, often with little regard for caution. Luxury cars, lavish homes, and extravagant lifestyles became symbols of their success. Yet, these displays of wealth were double-edged. They attracted attention not only from law enforcement but also from rival criminals who saw opportunity in the hubris of the winners. The balance between ostentation and discretion was fragile, and many who indulged too freely soon found themselves targets. The narrative of triumph quickly gave way to a narrative of survival, as the very spoils of the heist became instruments of danger. In the underworld, rumors and paranoia spread like wildfire. The knowledge of who had been involved, who had handled the money, and who could talk became a source of constant tension. Friendships were tested, alliances were questioned, and betrayal lurked in every corner. The aftermath of the Lufthansa heist demonstrated that in organized crime, a successful operation could be as perilous as a failed one. Success breeds scrutiny, and scrutiny breeds fear. The psychological toll on Henry Hill and his peers was profound, shaping their decisions and influencing their behavior in ways that were both subtle and dramatic. The consequences of the heist were not limited to legal repercussions. They extended deeply into the fabric of personal relationships, trust, and survival instincts. The story of the Lufthansa heist is not merely a tale of crime but a study in human behavior under extreme conditions. The audacity, intelligence, and meticulous planning that characterized the robbery are undeniable. Yet the aftermath reveals the fragility of human networks and the high cost of ambition. Every action, every choice, had repercussions that reverberated far beyond the moment of the crime. For Henry Hill, the experience was a stark lesson in the perilous intersection of opportunity and risk, teaching him that in the world of organized crime, the line between success and destruction is extraordinarily thin. In the quiet hours, as the city slept, the echoes of that December night at JFK Airport lingered in the minds of those involved. The adrenaline of execution had faded, replaced by vigilance, fear, anticipation. The Lufthansa heist had changed everything, not just in terms of wealth or notoriety, but in the way the mob operated, the way law enforcement approached organized crime, and the very lives of the men who had pulled it off. It was a stark reminder that in a world driven by greed and ambition, triumph is fleeting, and the consequences are often inevitable. The heist remains etched into history, a story of brilliance and recklessness, courage and paranoia, a narrative that continues to captivate those willing to listen, especially in the quiet moments when the mind drifts toward the shadowy corners of human experience. As the dust settled in the wake of the Lufthansa heist, the intricate machinery of the criminal underworld began to reveal its darker, more insidious gears. The robbery, executed with near-perfect precision, had made history, but in the shadows, the consequences of audacity were beginning to unfold. The very nature of organized crime dictated that knowledge of such a significant operation was dangerous, and those who had been part of it found themselves walking a tightrope of suspicion, fear, and betrayal. In the weeks following the theft, the psychological toll on Henry Hill and his associates became increasingly apparent. Every knock at the door, every unexpected phone call, every casual encounter held the potential for danger. In their world, information was power, and anyone with too much of it could quickly become a target. The mob's response to the heist was methodical and ruthless. While law enforcement scrambled to reconstruct the events, the Lucky's crime family, their associates were engaged in a parallel investigation, one guided by paranoia and the imperative to protect the organization. The sheer size of the haul, over $6 million in cash and nearly $1 million in jewelry, meant that multiple people had to have been involved. Even the slightest hint of betrayal could not be ignored. Men who had shared in the planning and execution were suddenly viewed with suspicion. Trust, a currency more valuable than any crate of cash, began to erode. Conversations were measured, alliances scrutinized, and friendships strained to the breaking point. The very success that had elevated them now served as a catalyst for fear and self-preservation. Henry Hill, who had long navigated the treacherous waters of the New York mob, understood the duality of the situation. He had been instrumental in the heist's success, yet that same success made him a potential threat in the eyes of others. The mob valued discretion above all else, and any hint that someone might reveal secrets, even inadvertently, was met with lethal consequences. The environment was tense, Everyone knew that survival depended not only on intelligence and cunning, but also on the ability to anticipate the motives and fears of others. Paranoia became a constant companion, and the line between friend and enemy blurred almost beyond recognition. In this high-stakes environment, the distribution of the stolen money became a critical and dangerous process. Laundering the cash required creativity and precision. The mob had established networks ranging from small businesses to gambling operations that could absorb illicit funds. But the scale of the Lufthansa heist presented unprecedented challenges. Each transaction carried the risk of exposure. Every person who handled the money was a potential point of vulnerability. While the allure of sudden wealth was intoxicating, it also increased the risk of mistakes, miscalculations, and, ultimately, death. For Henry Hill and his fellow conspirators, the management of the stolen fortune became a daily exercise in vigilance and strategic thinking. Meanwhile, the law enforcement response intensified. Federal agents meticulously pieced together the evidence, understanding that even in the absence of direct witnesses, patterns could be discerned, connections traced, and vulnerabilities exploited. Surveillance, interviews, and financial tracing became their weapons. The mob's code of silence, omerta, was formidable, but even the most disciplined organizations are susceptible to human error, fear, and betrayal. Rumors of informants circulated, and within the criminal community, trust was continuously tested. Those who had once celebrated their triumph now lived under the constant shadow of investigation, aware that any misstep could bring the full force of the law upon them. The human element of the aftermath cannot be overstated. The psychological weight of participating in one of the largest heists in American history pressed heavily upon Henry Hill and his associates. Sleep became elusive, replaced by hypervigilance and anxiety. Every knock on the door or sudden noise elicited a heightened response. The very act of existing in the same city as the crime and its participants became a source of constant tension. In many ways, the heist had transformed their lives irreversibly, replacing the thrill of criminal activity with the burden of survival. Even the casual social interactions of daily life were tinged with calculation and suspicion. Over time, the repercussions of the heist claimed the lives of many directly involved. The mob's insistence on secrecy and loyalty meant that those who could potentially compromise the operation, intentionally or otherwise, were systematically eliminated. These deaths were often carried out with cold precision, serving as a stark warning to others. Fear became a tool of control, a way to maintain order and prevent exposure. The violence that followed the heist was not spontaneous. It was calculated, strategic, and brutally efficient. For Henry Hill, witnessing the fates of friends and associates reinforced the fragility of existence. In the criminal underworld, where loyalty was prized but expendability was accepted, despite the fear and violence, the story of the Lufthansa heist continued to captivate. It represented the pinnacle of audacity, the combination of meticulous planning, insider knowledge, and sheer courage that few criminal enterprises could match. The robbery itself was a feat of logistical brilliance executed with minimal error and extraordinary coordination. Yet, the heist also serves as a stark reminder that even the most successful crimes carry consequences that extend far beyond the immediate moment. The money, while enormous in value, became as much a source of danger as it was of wealth. For Henry Hill and his contemporaries, the after effects were a constant lesson in the precarious nature of power, ambition, and human behavior. As the investigation progressed, the tension between law enforcement and organized crime intensified. Federal agencies pursued leads tirelessly, while the mob employed its own methods of intimidation, bribery, and surveillance to protect its interests. The dual pressure created an environment of extraordinary stress where one wrong move could result in arrest, incarceration, or death. The men involved had to navigate this intricate landscape with skill and caution, balancing the pursuit of personal gain with the need for security and discretion. Their lives became exercises in strategic thinking, psychological endurance, and calculated risk-taking. The Lufthansa heist also had cultural and historical significance beyond the immediate criminal and legal context. Its audacity and impact inspired books, documentaries, and, most famously, the cinematic portrayal in Goodfellas. Through these depictions, the story transcended its era, offering audiences a window into the mechanics of organized crime, the psychology of its participants, and the consequences of human ambition unchecked by moral constraint. Yet, the historical reality was far grimmer than any dramatization. The lives of those involved were marked by tension, fear, and the constant specter of death, a reality that rendered the heist both legendary and cautionary. Ultimately, The aftermath of the Lufthansa heist revealed the intricate, dangerous, and fragile balance within the world of organized crime. Success was fleeting, and the very qualities that enabled the robbery, intelligence, daring, and meticulous planning, could not shield participants from the human consequences of greed, fear, and betrayal. For Henry Hill and his associates, the heist was both a moment of triumph and the beginning of a prolonged period of danger, paranoia, and mortality. It is this interplay of brilliance and vulnerability that continues to fascinate, offering a story rich with lessons about ambition, human behavior, and the perils of navigating a world where the line between survival and destruction is perilously thin. The events that followed the Lufthansa heist exposed the fragile and dangerous world in which Henry Hill and his associates operated. The robbery had placed them at the pinnacle of audacity, yet it also left them exposed to unprecedented threats, both from within their own circles and from law enforcement. The air was thick with tension, and every interaction carried the weight of suspicion. No one could be trusted entirely, and every person connected to the heist, directly or indirectly, became a potential liability. The success of the robbery had not only drawn attention but also ignited a chain reaction of fear, betrayal, and paranoia that would dominate the lives of those involved for years to come. Henry Hill understood that the most dangerous enemy was often not the authorities but the people around him. Loyalty within the mob was notoriously volatile, influenced by fear, greed, and self-preservation. Men who had once been trusted allies now appeared through the lens of caution, their motives constantly questioned. The very knowledge of the heist, which had seemed a source of pride and power, transformed into a liability. The sense of security that had accompanied the meticulous planning and execution of the robbery quickly evaporated, replaced by the chilling realization that the same brilliance that enabled success could not guarantee survival. Every meeting, every conversation, was a subtle negotiation of trust and control, a careful dance to maintain one's place in a world that could turn lethal at a moment's notice. Distribution of the stolen money became a critical and dangerous task. The loot could not remain in one place for long, and the process of laundering it required intricate planning and execution. The mob had established networks capable of absorbing illicit funds through businesses and gambling operations, but the scale of the Lufthansa heist presented challenges unlike any they had previously encountered. Each transaction, each movement of cash, carried inherent risk. Missteps could attract the attention of law enforcement or incite suspicion within the organization. The process demanded not only discretion but also vigilance, as the consequences of exposure were fatal. In this climate, the men involved had to balance the desire for immediate gain with the long-term necessity of survival. The human consequences of the heist were profound. Over time, individuals who had played a part in the robbery began to disappear under mysterious circumstances. Some were found dead, their bodies serving as grim reminders of the price of involvement. Others vanished entirely, leaving only uncertainty and speculation. The mob's reliance on fear as a tool of control became evident as potential witnesses, or those perceived as risks, were systematically eliminated. The environment was one of constant vigilance, where survival required not only intelligence and skill but also an acute awareness of human behavior and the motivations of others. Henry Hill and his peers lived in a state of perpetual tension, acutely aware that any misstep could have catastrophic consequences. Meanwhile, law enforcement intensified its investigation. The FBI, armed with intelligence, surveillance, and the determination to bring perpetrators to justice, pursued leads with relentless precision. Agents reconstructed the sequence of events, piecing together evidence, identifying potential witnesses, and analyzing the flow of stolen money. The mob's code of silence, while formidable, was not impenetrable. Fear, betrayal, and the natural pressures of criminal life create vulnerabilities, and law enforcement was adept at exploiting them. The dual pressure of avoiding detection while navigating internal threat created a climate of extraordinary stress, further complicating the lives of those involved as the weeks turned into months. Henry Hill experienced the psychological weight of the heist in increasingly profound ways. Sleep was often disrupted by nightmares or the constant awareness of surveillance and danger. Daily life required careful calculation, as even casual conversation could inadvertently reveal knowledge that might place him at risk. The adrenaline and excitement of the robbery gave way to the sobering reality of its aftermath. The men who had once celebrated their audacious success now found themselves negotiating every aspect of their existence, balancing personal desires, loyalty, and the unrelenting demands of survival in a world defined by secrecy and violence. The Mafia's response to the heist was strategic, calculated, and chillingly efficient. The Code of Omerta demanded absolute secrecy, and anyone perceived as a threat to that code was dealt with swiftly. Over time, individuals connected to the robbery were either silenced or eliminated. These deaths were often carried out with a level of planning as meticulous as the heist itself. The underlying message was clear: the consequence of disloyalty or carelessness were immediate and lethal. Within this framework, the men involved had to navigate not only the practical aspects of handling and laundering money but also the ever-present risk of internal betrayal. Trust became a rare commodity, and survival depended as much on perception and subtlety as on skill or cunning. Despite the danger, the allure of wealth and power continued to exert its influence. The stolen millions provided opportunities for luxury, indulgence, and social standing within the criminal world. However, these displays of affluence were inherently risky, drawing attention not only from law enforcement, but also from rival factions who viewed ostentation as vulnerability. The men involved in the heist had to carefully calibrate their lifestyle, balancing the desire for enjoyment with the necessity of discretion. In this delicate balance, each action carried significant consequences, as even minor errors could unravel years of careful planning and put lives at risk. Culturally, the Lufthansa heist came to symbolize the audacity and danger of organized crime in America. It was a crime that transcended its immediate context, offering lessons about human ambition, the interplay of greed and morality, and the fragile nature of alliances within a world defined by risk. Its legacy extended beyond the criminal community, inspiring books, films, and historical analysis that sought to understand both the mechanics of the heist and the psychology of the individuals involved. Through these depictions, the story endured, capturing the imagination of audiences who marveled at the intelligence, courage, and ultimately, the tragic vulnerabilities of those who orchestrated it. In the quiet moments when the city slept and the streets were still, the impact of the Lufthansa heist remained palpable. Henry Hill and his peers were forever changed, navigating a world where the thrill of victory was inseparable from the fear of betrayal. The heist had achieved legendary status, yet it had done so at an extraordinary human cost. Lives were lost, trust was shattered, and the psychological burden on the survivors was immense. The story of the Lufthansa heist is, therefore, a narrative of contrast, triumph and tragedy, brilliance and danger, audacity and consequence. It is this tension that continues to captivate, offering a cautionary tale and a compelling narrative that echoes through history, lingering in the imagination of those who listen, especially in the still hours when the mind drifts toward the shadowed corners of human ambition and the precarious nature of power. The days following the Lufthansa heist were marked by a tension that few outside the criminal world could fully comprehend. The robbery, executed with the precision of a master plan, had not only brought unprecedented wealth to the crew but also thrust them into a dangerous spotlight. Henry Hill, along with the other key figures, found themselves navigating a delicate landscape where the consequences of each action were magnified by both fear and opportunity. The stolen millions had transformed their lives, but the transformation was far from idyllic. Wealth came with its own chains, and freedom was measured not in dollars, but in the ability to survive the ever-present threats surrounding them. At the center of this precarious existence was the need to protect the loot while managing the intricate social dynamics of the mob. Money laundering became a daily preoccupation, and every movement of cash required meticulous planning. The crew utilized a network of businesses, including bars, nightclubs, and legitimate enterprises, to conceal the flow of stolen funds. The process was fraught with danger. Any misstep could trigger attention from law enforcement or arouse suspicion within the organization. The sophistication of the operation was impressive, but even the most skilled operatives understood that the heist had opened a door to a world where survival was as important as wealth. Paranoia began to dominate the lives of those involved. Henry Hill was acutely aware that knowledge is both power and a liability. Men who had previously been allies were now evaluated through a lens of mistrust. Conversations were scrutinized for hidden meaning, and actions were interpreted as potential threats. The stakes had shifted from simply executing a high-profile robbery to navigating a complex web of suspicion and fear. The psychological weight of this reality was immense, influencing every interaction, decision, and movement. In the criminal world, success is fleeting, and the very brilliance that enabled the heist was now a potential source of danger. The mob's response to the heist was calculated and methodical. Those who were suspected of posing a threat to the secrecy of the operation were dealt with swiftly. A series of disappearances and murders soon followed, each reinforcing the lethal consequences of disloyalty or perceived incompetence. The environment was one in which survival required constant vigilance and an acute understanding of human behavior. Henry Hill witnessed firsthand how quickly alliances could shift and how easily trust could be broken. The heist, while a monumental success in terms of execution, had inadvertently sown the seeds of fear, betrayal and death. Law enforcement, meanwhile, was closing in, though the path to justice was complicated by the mob's tight control and adherence to omerta. The FBI and other federal agencies pursued leads meticulously, analyzing movements, financial records, and relationships with painstaking care. Even in the absence of direct witnesses, patterns emerged, and slowly, the network behind the heist began to unravel. The dual pressures of law enforcement scrutiny and internal threats created a climate in which every decision carried life or death consequences. For Henry Hill, daily life became a careful exercise in balance, weighing the desire for personal gain against the ever-present risk of exposure. Amid this tension, the human dimension of the aftermath became increasingly evident. The psychological toll on those involved was profound. The exhilaration of the robbery was replaced by constant anxiety, and the men lived with the knowledge that any mistake could prove fatal. Sleep became scarce, and the simple acts of walking the streets, attending meetings, or even speaking to acquaintances were fraught with risk. The world they had chosen to inhabit was one in which every gesture could be scrutinized and every conversation could carry hidden danger. For Henry Hill, the experience was both intoxicating and terrifying, a constant reminder of the fragile balance between power and peril. The distribution of the stolen money highlighted the sophistication and danger of organized crime. Funds were moved through carefully controlled channels, laundered through businesses that served as fronts for illicit activity. Yet, the scale of the Lufthansa heist presented challenges unlike any previous operation. Each transfer of money required secrecy, precision, and trust that was increasingly difficult to maintain in a climate of fear and suspicion. The very magnitude of the theft, which had initially brought prestige, became a liability, magnifying the scrutiny of both allies and enemies. In this environment, success was measured not only by the accumulation of wealth but also by the ability to navigate the treacherous social and organizational terrain that the heist had created. The consequences of the heist extended beyond immediate danger. Friendships, partnerships, and loyalties were tested as the fallout intensified. Men who had once been close associates now viewed one another with suspicion, and alliances were continually reassessed. Betrayal lurked in every corner, whether motivated by fear, greed, or survival instincts. The world of organized crime, already complex and ruthless, became even more perilous as the heist set off a chain of events that few could have anticipated. For Henry Hill, understanding human behavior, anticipating reactions, and managing relationships became as important as planning or executing any criminal act. Culturally, the Lufthansa heist became a symbol of audacity and ambition, a story that resonated far beyond the immediate criminal community. Its depiction in books and films, most notably Goodfellas, captured the imagination of audiences worldwide. Yet, the reality was far more chilling than dramatization could convey. The psychological strain, the fear, the constant risk of betrayal, and the lethal consequence of even minor missteps painted a picture of crime that was both brilliant and brutal. The story of the heist is therefore a study not only of criminal ingenuity, but also of the human capacity for risk, ambition, and resilience under extreme pressure. Ultimately, the aftermath of the Lufthansa heist underscored the precariousness of life in the underworld. Success, while intoxicating, carried with it the seas of destruction. The wealth gained through audacity was inseparable from the fear it generated, and the thrill of achievement was shadowed by the ever-present specter of danger. Henry Hill and his contemporaries navigated a world where every decision had weighty consequences, and survival depended as much on psychological acuity as on cunning or planning. The heist had changed everything: the lives of those involved, the operation of the mob, and the perception of organized crime in America. It was a story of triumph and peril, brilliance and vulnerability, that continues to resonate as a testament to the complex interplay between ambition and consequence. In the quiet moments, long after the robbery and its immediate aftermath, the echoes of that night at JFK Airport lingered. The adrenaline and excitement of the heist were replaced by vigilance, fear, and the constant awareness of danger. Every success, every display of wealth, every casual interaction carried potential consequences. The Lufthansa heist was not merely a crime, it was a profound lesson in human ambition, the fragility of trust, and the intricate balance between power and survival. It is this tension between audacity and peril that makes the story endlessly fascinating, a narrative that continues to captivate those willing to listen to the shadowed corridors of human ambition and the dangerous allure of life outside the law. The months following the Lufthansa heist revealed the harsh truth that in the world of organized crime, even the most brilliant schemes carry consequences that extend far beyond the immediate act of theft. The adrenaline of the robbery had faded, leaving behind a lingering tension that gripped every aspect of daily life for Henry Hill and his associates. The initial triumph, once so intoxicating, now coexisted with the weight of paranoia, suspicion, and the constant awareness that any mistake could be fatal. In the underworld, success is never permanent, and every victory comes with its own shadows. The Lufthansa heist, celebrated for its audacity and meticulous execution, had set in motion a chain of events that tested the limits of trust, loyalty, and human endurance. Henry Hill quickly realized that wealth, while enticing, could also be a dangerous burden. The stolen millions required careful management, both to avoid drawing attention from law enforcement and to prevent internal conflicts within the mob. Laundering the money was a complex task. The crew moved funds through legitimate businesses, nightclubs, and casinos, integrating the cash into the broader economy in a manner that masked its illicit origins. Each transfer demanded precision and discretion, as even the smallest error could have disastrous consequences. The challenge was not simply in handling the money, but in doing so within a landscape defined by fear, suspicion, and the ruthless expectations of organized crime. The aftermath of the heist also illustrated the fragile nature of loyalty within the mob. The men who had executed the robbery together were now navigating a world in which every relationship was subject to scrutiny. Friends could become threats, and allies could turn into enemies at a moment's notice. Henry Hill observed the subtle shifts in behavior around him, noting how fear and greed could undermine even the strongest bonds. Conversations were measured, gestures careful, calculated, and trust was a currency more valuable than any creative cash. In this climate, survival depended not only on intelligence and planning but also on an acute understanding of human psychology and the motivations of those around him. The mob's response to the heist was both strategic and ruthless. The leadership recognized that the scale of the crime had exposed vulnerabilities that could not be ignored. Individuals who were suspected of possessing too much knowledge or demonstrating potential for disloyalty were systematically eliminated. Disappearances and murders followed in the wake of the robbery, serving both as punishment and as a warning to others. These acts were not impulsive. They were calculated, executed with precision, and designed to maintain control over the organization. The environment became one in which fear was as essential a tool as money or muscle, and the psychological pressure on those involved was immense. Meanwhile, law enforcement continued its relentless pursuit. The FBI, alongside other federal agencies, employed sophisticated investigative techniques to reconstruct the events leading up to and following the robbery. Surveillance, informants, and meticulous financial tracking gradually illuminated the networks responsible for the heist. The mob's strict adherence to omerta created challenges, but human error, stress, and fear inevitably created cracks in the armor. Every interaction, every decision, became a potential source of exposure, further amplifying the tension that had enveloped Henry Hill and his peers. The dual pressures of avoiding detection by authorities while navigating internal threats created a near-constant state of anxiety. The human toll of this environment was profound. Henry Hill and others experienced sleepless nights, hypervigilance, and a persistent sense of danger. Simple acts of daily life, walking through the streets, meeting acquaintances, even answering the phone, were fraught with risk. The excitement of the robbery had been replaced by the sobering reality of survival in a world where knowledge could be deadly. Every action, every word, carried weight, and the consequences of miscalculation were immediate and often irreversible. The psychological burden of living in such a world left lasting scars even for those who had previously thrived in high-stakes criminal endeavors. The distribution of the stolen money remained a critical concern. The crew had to ensure that the funds were divided appropriately while avoiding the attention of authorities and minimizing the risk of internal disputes. The laundering process required coordination with a network of businesses, intermediaries, all of whom operated under the constant threat of exposure. The scale of the heist made this task particularly challenging. Each movement of money had to be justified, documented, and concealed, requiring constant vigilance and careful planning. The success of the operation now depended as much on the management of its proceeds as it had on the execution of the robbery itself. Internal tensions within the crew grew as the pressures mounted. Fear, greed, and mistrust began to influence decisions and behavior. Henry Hill observed the subtle dynamics of his peers, noting how the smallest actions could indicate potential betrayal or disloyalty. In a world where the line between life and death could hinge on a single misstep, even minor conflicts were magnified. The psychological complexity of these interactions demanded constant attention, and the ability to anticipate the motivations of others became as essential as any practical skill. Success in the criminal underworld was now measured not only by the audacity of the heist, but by the ability to navigate the dangerous social landscape it had created. The Lufthansa heist also highlighted the tension between ambition and survival. While the allure of wealth was powerful, It was accompanied by the stark realities of life in organized crime. The men involved were forced to reconcile their desire for prosperity with the constant threat of exposure and retaliation. Every choice had consequences, and the pursuit of one objective could inadvertently endanger multiple others. For Henry Hill, this tension was a defining feature of his existence, shaping his decisions and influencing his interactions at every level. The heist had provided a fleeting moment of triumph, but it had also established a perpetual state of vigilance that would define life in the months and years that followed. Culturally, the Lufthansa heist would endure as a symbol of audacity, intelligence, and the complex consequences of human ambition. Its depiction in film, literature, and popular culture captured the imagination of audiences worldwide, providing both a dramatic narrative and a cautionary tale. Yet, beneath the dramatization lay a far more sobering reality: the psychological strain, the fear of betrayal, the constant threat of violence, and the meticulous management of stolen wealth painted a portrait of organized crime that was both brilliant and brutal. The story continues to resonate because it offers insight into the human condition under extreme circumstances, highlighting the interplay of risk, ambition, loyalty, and survival. Ultimately, the Lufthansa heist serves as a study in the complexities of human behavior within the framework of organized crime. The audacity of the robbery, while remarkable, was only one facet of a larger, far more intricate story. The aftermath, characterized by fear, suspicion, and the constant management of risk, revealed the precarious balance that defined life for those involved. For Henry Hill and his contemporaries, survival required intelligence, vigilance, and an understanding of both human nature and the harsh realities of the criminal world. The heist had changed everything, not only the lives of the participants, but also the operations of the mob and the perception of organized crime in America. Even in quiet moments, the echoes of that night at JFK Airport persisted. The thrill of the robbery was overshadowed by the responsibilities, fears, and dangers that followed. The Lufthansa heist was more than a crime. It was a profound lesson in ambition, loyalty, and the intricate balance of power and peril. It remains a story that continues to captivate, providing insight into human behavior, the consequences of audacity, and the complex realities of life in the shadows of the law. For those who listen closely, it is a narrative that lingers in the mind, a darkly mesmerizing tale of ingenuity, greed, and the delicate line between survival and destruction. The months that followed the Lufthansa heist were a lesson in the delicate balance between audacity and survival. The robbery had been executed with near-perfect precision, yet its consequence unfolded in ways that were as unpredictable as they were dangerous. Henry Hill and his associates, who had once basked in the thrill of their success, now found themselves navigating a world filled with suspicion, fear, and uncertainty. Every day presented new challenges, not only in managing the immense wealth they had acquired, but also in protecting themselves from threats that lurked both within and outside their own circles. The exhilaration of the heist had been replaced by a constant awareness that every interaction could carry deadly implications. The money taken from Lufthansa was enormous, but it was not simply a treasure to be enjoyed. In the world of organized crime, wealth requires management, strategy, and discretion. Henry Hill and the crew were faced with the difficult task of laundering the funds, moving them through legitimate businesses, gambling operations, and other channels to conceal their origins. Each transfer of money had to be executed flawlessly, and every decision carried weight. The smallest error could invite attention from law enforcement or create suspicion within the mob. Managing the stolen funds became a daily exercise in vigilance, requiring intelligence, patience, and constant awareness of both opportunity and danger. As they attempted to integrate the money into the broader criminal ecosystem, internal tensions began to surface. Success had amplified existing rivalries, and the fear of betrayal hung heavily over every interaction. The men involved in the heist were acutely aware that any individual possessing too much knowledge could be a liability. Conversations were measured, gestures scrutinized, and loyalty was constantly tested. Trust, which had been a cornerstone of their operation, became increasingly fragile. Henry Hill observed these dynamics carefully, understanding that survival in the aftermath of the heist depended as much on psychological insight and interpersonal skill as it did on practical measures or criminal expertise. The mob's response to the heist reflected its ruthless pragmatism. The leadership recognized the threat posed by knowledge and acted accordingly. Individuals suspected of disloyalty or of possessing information that could compromise the organization were systematically eliminated. Disappearances and murders followed, each reinforcing the consequences of betrayal and the importance of maintaining secrecy. These acts were not random. They were strategic, calculated, and designed to protect the broader interests of the family. For Henry Hill and others involved, witnessing these outcomes reinforced the stark reality that in organized crime, loyalty was expected, and failure to conform to that expectation could be fatal. Meanwhile, law enforcement was methodically piecing together the events surrounding the heist. The FBI and other federal agencies employed sophisticated investigative techniques, including surveillance, financial tracing, and interviews with associates to reconstruct the crime. Even with the mob's strict adherence to omerta, the sheer scale of the operation made complete secrecy impossible. Fear, human error, and the pressures of criminal life created vulnerabilities that investigators could exploit. The dual pressures of avoiding capture by law enforcement while navigating internal threat created a climate of constant stress and vigilance for Henry Hill and his associates. Survival depended not only on skill and intelligence, but also on anticipating the actions and motivations of those around them. The human cost of the heist became increasingly evident as the months progressed. The psychological toll was immense. Henry Hill and his peers lived under the shadow of constant danger, their lives defined by hypervigilance, fear, and uncertainty. Sleep was elusive, and even ordinary activities were fraught with risk. The thrill of the robbery had been replaced by the sobering reality of life. In the aftermath, where every action could have profound consequences, friends and allies were continuously evaluated for potential threats, and the smallest misstep could result in violence or death. The experience demanded constant attention, acute awareness, and the ability to navigate a complex and often deadly social landscape. The management of the stolen funds was a continual challenge. The crew had to ensure that the money was moved, laundered, and distributed in ways that minimized exposure while maximizing utility. This required coordination with a network of businesses and intermediaries, each carrying its own risks. The larger the operation, the more points of vulnerability existed. Henry Hill understood that the very success of the heist could attract attention, and that wealth, while empowering, could also be dangerous. Every decision about the money was calculated, with both opportunity and risk carefully weighed. The stolen millions were not simply a reward, they were a responsibility, a burden, and a potential source of peril. Internal pressures continued to shape the dynamics of the group. Fear and mistrust influenced behavior, decisions, and interactions. Henry Hill observed the subtle signals of potential disloyalty, noting how small gestures or deviations from expected behavior could indicate deeper problems. In this environment, success was not measured solely by the acquisition of wealth, but by the ability to navigate human relationships, anticipate threats, and maintain security. The heist had elevated the men involved to a position of notoriety, but it had also exposed them to unprecedented danger. Every moment required calculation, foresight, and caution. As the line between triumph and tragedy was perilously thin, the Lufthansa heist also became a symbol of audacity and ambition, not only in the criminal world but in popular culture. Its depiction in films, literature, and historical accounts captured the imagination of audiences worldwide. Yet beneath the dramatization lay the harsh realities faced by those involved. The fear, paranoia, and constant threat of violence were ever present, shaping daily life in profound ways. The heist was a testament to human ingenuity, planning, and courage, but it also served as a cautionary tale about the consequences of unchecked ambition and the fragility of trust within high-stakes criminal enterprises. Ultimately, the Lufthansa heist demonstrated that in the world of organized crime, every victory is inseparable from risk. The men who executed the robbery displayed remarkable intelligence and audacity, yet their survival depended equally on psychological insight, discretion, and adaptability. Henry Hill, navigating the aftermath, understood that the heist had changed everything: the operation of the mob, the perception of organized crime, and the very nature of his existence. Triumph was fleeting, and the constant shadow of danger shaped every decision, every interaction, and every step forward. The story of the heist continues to resonate, offering insight into ambition, human behavior, and the complex interplay between risk and reward. Even in quiet moments, the echoes of that December night at JFK Airport persisted. The excitement and adrenaline of the heist had faded, replaced by vigilance, fear, and the realization that every moment carried consequences. The Lufthansa heist was not just a crime, it was a profound lesson in human ambition, the fragile nature of trust, and the intricate balance between audacity and survival. For those willing to listen closely, it remains a mesmerizing tale of intelligence, greed, danger, and the precarious line between triumph and destruction. As the weeks and months continued to unfold after the Lufthansa heist, the quiet streets of New York carried a new undercurrent of tension and unease. Henry Hill and his associates were acutely aware that their lives had changed irreversibly. The heist, executed with breathtaking audacity, had secured millions of dollars, but it had also placed them under a microscope of both law enforcement scrutiny and internal mob suspicion. The thrill of success, which had once coursed through their veins like electricity, was gradually replaced by the relentless anxiety of survival. Every interaction, every conversation, every movement carried weight, and the boundaries between friend and foe blurred with each passing day. The money, now in their possession, was both a boon and a burden. Handling such vast sums required careful planning, not only to conceal the funds from authorities but also to manage the intricate social dynamics within the mob. Laundering the stolen money demanded precision, creativity, and absolute discretion. The crew used a network of bars, clubs, and legitimate businesses to convert their ill-gotten gains into usable assets. Even the slightest misstep could result in suspicion, internal conflict, or law enforcement intervention. In this high-stakes environment, the stolen cash was not merely wealth, it was a source of constant tension, requiring strategic oversight and vigilance. Internal trust became the most fragile and valuable commodity. Henry Hill learned quickly that knowledge could be as dangerous as it was empowering. Every associate, every friend, and even casual acquaintances could potentially compromise the operation. Conversations were measured, gestures analyzed, and actions interpreted with extreme caution. Paranoia became a constant companion, shaping decisions and interactions in profound ways. The men who had once executed a flawless heist now navigated an environment in which the rules had shifted. Survival depended not just on cunning but on the ability to anticipate the intentions of others. The very brilliance that had enabled the heist now demanded an equal measure of psychological acuity. The mob's reaction to the robbery was systematic and calculated. Recognizing the risks posed by widespread knowledge of the heist, the leadership employed fear and intimidation to maintain control. Individuals suspected of being a liability or of possessing too much information were dealt with ruthlessly. Disappearances, threats, and murders became tools to reinforce discipline and loyalty. The consequences were unmistakable. Silence and obedience were paramount, and deviation from this code could result in death. For Henry Hill and his peers, this reality was a daily presence, shaping behavior, alliances, and even casual interactions. The thrill of the heist was overshadowed by the stark understanding that survival was now the ultimate priority. At the same time, law enforcement pursued their investigation with relentless determination. The FBI and other federal agencies utilized surveillance, financial tracking, and informants to uncover the network behind the heist. While the mob's code of omerta provided some protection, human vulnerability, fear, and stress created cracks in their defenses. Investigators meticulously traced the flow of stolen money, mapped connections, and pieced together timelines, slowly closing in on those responsible. The pressure of evading capture, combined with the internal threats from the mob, created a constant tension that defined daily life for Henry Hill and his associates. Every decision, no matter how trivial, had the potential to alter their fates. Psychologically, the impact of this pressure was profound. The initial exhilaration of the heist, the adrenaline that had propelled them to success, had been replaced by a heightened state of vigilance. Sleep was elusive, and even routine activities were fraught with potential risk. Henry Hill had to navigate a complex web of human behavior, understanding that every action could have unintended consequences. Trust was scarce, alliances were fragile, and the line between survival and disaster was extraordinarily thin. The heist had transformed their existence, turning what might have seemed like an extraordinary adventure into a continuous exercise in caution, foresight, and psychological endurance. Managing the stolen funds remained a constant challenge. The crew had to carefully orchestrate the flow of money through multiple channels to avoid detection and prevent disputes among themselves. Money laundering was not merely a technical procedure, it was a strategic operation that required negotiation, coordination, and a keen understanding of both opportunity and risk. Each movement of cash carried the possibility of exposure, whether from law enforcement, scrutiny, rival factions, or mistakes by those handling the funds. The men involved understood that wealth, while alluring, was inseparable from danger, and that careful management was essential to preserving both their assets and their lives. Internal conflicts also intensified as the stakes increased. Fear, mistrust, and greed combined to strain relationships and amplify tension. Henry Hill observed the subtle behaviors that could indicate potential betrayal, understanding that even minor deviations from expected conduct could have serious consequences. In a world where knowledge was lethal, survival depended on acute observation, strategic thinking, and the ability to anticipate human behavior. Success was measured not only by the accumulation of wealth but also by the ability to navigate an environment where social dynamics were as treacherous as any physical threat. The cultural legacy of the Lufthansa heist grew alongside its immediate consequences. The story became emblematic of audacity, ambition, and the precarious nature of criminal enterprise. Its depiction in films and literature, particularly in Goodfellas, captivated audiences worldwide, highlighting both the brilliance of the planning and the human cost of execution. While dramatizations focused on the suspense and excitement, the historical reality was far more sobering. Lives were endangered, fear dominated daily life, and the psychological burden of participation was immense. The heist remains a case study in the interplay between risk, ambition, and consequence, providing insight into the complexities of human behavior under extreme conditions. Ultimately, the Lufthansa heist was more than a robbery. It was a turning point that redefined the lives of those involved. Henry Hill and his associates had achieved an extraordinary feat. Yet that success came with a perpetual shadow of danger. The months that followed were defined by vigilance, strategy, and the constant negotiation of trust. Every interaction carried weight. Every decision could tip the balance between survival and disaster, and every moment demanded a combination of intelligence, foresight, and caution. The heist had changed the rules of their existence, creating a world in which triumph and peril were inseparable companions. Even in the quiet, reflective moments, the echoes of that December night at JFK Airport remained vivid. The exhilaration of the heist had faded, leaving behind a landscape of caution, fear, and calculated opportunity. For Henry Hill and the crew, the Lufthansa heist was not merely a story of audacity. It was a profound lesson in human behavior, loyalty, and the fragile balance between ambition and survival. It remains a tale that continues to captivate, a mesmerizing narrative of brilliance, danger, and the thin line between triumph and catastrophe. The weeks after the Lufthansa heist gradually revealed the deeper complexities of life in the underworld, far beyond the immediate thrill of stealing millions of dollars in cash and jewelry. Henry Hill and his associates soon realized that the robbery, while brilliantly executed, had introduced challenges far more complicated than the heist itself. The excitement and adrenaline of the operation were replaced by vigilance, fear, and the constant need to calculate every step. In the criminal world, knowledge is both power and danger, and the success of the Lufthansa heist meant that every person who had been involved, who even knew details, became a potential liability. For Henry Hill, the reality of living under such pressure was as consuming as the heist had been exhilarating. The first challenge was survival. While law enforcement began piecing together the events, internal threats loomed just as large. The Lufthansa crime family, intent on maintaining control and protecting the secrecy of the operation, took decisive and often brutal action against anyone they perceived as a risk. Disappearances, beatings, and murders followed, serving as grim reminders of the stakes. Those who had access to information about the heist were particularly vulnerable. Henry Hill witnessed the consequences of knowledge firsthand. A man who once shared a laugh could vanish overnight, leaving only fear in his wake. Paranoia became a constant companion, shaping both thought and action. Every gesture, every word, every alliance had to be considered carefully, for misjudgment could be fatal. Managing the stolen money became a high-stakes endeavor in itself. Millions of dollars were now in circulation, but unaccounted for wealth was as dangerous as a loaded weapon. The crew worked tirelessly to launder the money through legitimate businesses, casinos, and bars, each transaction requiring meticulous planning. They understood that law enforcement was actively tracing large cash movement, and that the mob's own members were watching as closely as the authorities. The stolen funds were more than wealth. They were a test of discipline, intelligence, and survival instincts. Any careless move could alert authorities or provoke the ire of the mob, and the consequences of either were severe. Henry Hill's daily life became an intricate balancing act between opportunity and threat. The adrenaline that had driven him during the heist was now replaced by vigilance, observation, and careful calculation. Every meeting, every conversation, every seemingly ordinary encounter carried potential risk. The distinction between friend and foe blurred as loyalty proved fragile and fear pervasive. In the shadow of the Lufthansa heist, the men involved learned that the greatest danger did not always come from outside the organization, but often from those closest to them. Trust had become a rare and precious commodity, and the ability to read human behavior was as critical as any other skill in the criminal world. The mob's calculated response to the heist further intensified the atmosphere of tension. Leadership understood that widespread knowledge of the robbery was a liability, and they acted swiftly to mitigate any perceived threats. Individuals suspected of being potential informants or of possessing too much information were dealt with ruthlessly. Threats, disappearances, and murders became tools to maintain order and enforce loyalty. Henry Hill observed these measures with a mixture of awe and fear. While the strategy ensured the continued secrecy of the operation, it also created a pervasive climate of paranoia where survival depended on both discretion and psychological acuity. The success of the heist had inadvertently turned those who had participated into targets, forcing them to navigate a treacherous web of danger on all sides. Law enforcement, meanwhile, continued its relentless pursuit. The FBI meticulously traced the flow of money, analyzed contacts, and scrutinized the movements of individuals connected to the heist. The mob's code of silence, omerta, provided some insulation, but fear and human error slowly created vulnerabilities. Investigators exploited these cracks, building an understanding of the operation and the network behind it. The dual pressures of evading legal consequences while surviving the internal wrath of the mob create an almost unbearable tension for Henry Hill and his associates. Every action, every word, and every decision had consequences that could determine not just their freedom, but their lives. The psychological impact of this environment was profound. Henry Hill and his peers lived in a constant state of alertness where sleep was often elusive, and every ordinary activity carried potential danger. The excitement of the heist was replaced by the sobering reality of living in the aftermath where every gesture could be interpreted as a threat, and every conversation could expose dangerous knowledge. The stress was cumulative, infiltrating even moments that had once been ordinary or pleasurable. Life had become a careful exercise in strategy, observation, and the management of fear. The men involved were forced to reconcile the allure of wealth with the omnipresent dangers that accompanied it. Internal dynamics further complicated the aftermath. Rivalries, jealousy, and mistrust emerged as the crew attempted to manage the proceeds of the heist. Fear of betrayal exacerbated tensions, and alliances shifted subtly but constantly. Henry Hill had to maintain a delicate balance, ensuring that he navigated relationship wisely while managing the inherent risk of every interaction. Even minor deviations from expected behavior could spark suspicion, and in a world where information was power, vigilance was critical. The successful heist, which had demonstrated extraordinary skill and audacity, had now created a complex social labyrinth where survival depended on acute perception and strategic action. The Lufthansa heist also left a lasting cultural imprint. Its audacity, skill, and consequences captured the imagination of both the criminal world and the public. Films, books, and documentaries recounted the story, emphasizing the meticulous planning and sheer courage required to execute the crime. Yet the reality was far more sobering than any dramatization. The fear, paranoia, and psychological strain endured by those involved were profound, illustrated the high cost of human ambition in a world defined by secrecy and violence. The story endures because it offers insight not only into criminal ingenuity but also into human behavior, loyalty, and the complex interplay of risk and reward. Ultimately, the Lufthansa heist exemplified the precarious nature of success in the underworld. While Henry Hill and his associates had pulled off one of the most audacious robberies in history, survival demanded more than brilliance and courage. Psychological acuity, careful management of resources, and an understanding of human behavior became as essential as any criminal skill. The heist changed everything. It altered the operations of the mob, reshaped the lives of those involved, and redefined the perception of organized crime in America. Triumph in this world was inseparable from peril, and every moment of wealth and power carried the weight of danger. Even in quiet, reflective moments, the echoes of the Lufthansa heist persisted. The thrill of the robbery had long since faded, replaced by vigilance, strategy, and the awareness of constant threats. Henry Hill understood that the heist was more than a story of daring. It was a profound lesson in ambition, human behavior, and the delicate balance between audacity and survival. It remains a tale that continues to captivate, offering insight into the interplay of power, risk, and consequence, and reminding all who listen of the fine line between triumph and catastrophe in the shadowed world of organized crime. By the time the dust began to settle after the Lufthansa heist, the reality of the crime's aftermath was becoming increasingly evident. Henry Hill and his associates were living in a world transformed, where every day demanded constant vigilance and meticulous calculation. The exhilaration of the heist, which had once provided a heady rush of power and audacity, had given way to the weighty responsibilities of survival. In the months that followed, the stolen millions became as much a burden as a blessing. They were a source of wealth, certainly, but also a magnet for attention from law enforcement, from rival factions, and, perhaps most dangerously, from within the very organization that had sanctioned the operation. Managing the stolen money became a central and dangerous preoccupation. The sheer scale of the funds required strategic laundering through a network of legitimate businesses, gambling operations, and other fronts. Each transaction had to be carefully monitored, each movement of cash meticulously planned. Any error, no matter how minor, could draw unwanted attention or spark suspicion among the mob leadership. Henry Hill understood that money, while symbolizing success, also carried a persistent and insidious danger. Every decision regarding its use had to balance opportunity with security, wealth with survival. The challenge was not just financial, it was profoundly psychological. demanding constant awareness of both human behavior and external threats. The tension within the mob organization intensified as the stolen funds circulated. Success, which had brought admiration and status, now fueled envy, suspicion, and fear. Individuals who had played key roles in the heist were acutely aware that knowledge could be fatal. Conversations were measured and interactions calculated. Trust, once a functional necessity, had become a rare commodity. Henry Hill observed the subtle ways in which alliances shifted, noting how fear and self-interest reshaped relationships. In this new reality, survival depended not merely on intelligence or skill, but on the ability to anticipate the intentions of others and navigate an environment in which every gesture could have consequences. The mob's response to the heist reflected its characteristic ruthlessness and strategic discipline. Leadership recognized that widespread knowledge of the robbery posed a threat to the organization. Individuals perceived as risks were quietly but decisively removed from the equation. Disappearances and murders served as both punishment and a warning to others, reinforcing the importance of loyalty and discretion. For Henry Hill, witnessing these events underscored the lethal consequences of involvement. The heist had elevated the participants to a position of notoriety, but that elevation came with the stark reality that any perceived misstep could end in death. Survival now demanded not only careful handling of the stolen money, but also the management of human relationships with extraordinary precision. Law enforcement continued to pursue leads with unwavering persistence. The FBI and other federal agencies meticulously traced the flow of money, identified patterns, and scrutinized the network of individuals connected to the crime. While the mob's code of omerta provided some protection, it could not eliminate the vulnerability created by human fear, mistakes, and the pressures of high-stakes criminal life. Henry Hill and his peers lived under the dual threat of legal prosecution and internal retribution, a combination that heightened stress and amplified the consequences of every action. Vigilance became a constant necessity, and the stakes were nothing less than life or death. The psychological toll of this environment was profound. Henry Hill experienced the weight of constant surveillance, fear, and uncertainty. Sleep was often disrupted, and moments of normalcy were overshadowed by the knowledge that every encounter could carry risk. The thrill of a heist, once so exhilarating, had given way to a relentless cycle of caution and anticipation. Human behavior, once taken for granted, now required careful observation and analysis. Trust had to be earned and constantly reassessed. Survival depended on the ability to navigate the subtle dynamics of loyalty, jealousy, and fear, all while managing the practical demands of wealth and influence. Handling the stolen money was not merely a matter of logistics, it was also a psychological challenge. The crew needed to ensure that funds were moved and integrated without drawing attention, while simultaneously preventing disputes among themselves. Every decision about money had to balance opportunity with risk. The stakes were magnified by the sheer scale of the heist. Unlike smaller operations, a single miscalculation could unravel months of careful planning. Henry Hill recognized that wealth was inseparable from danger, and that the success of the heist imposed a continuous demand for strategic oversight and psychological acuity. Internal pressures compounded these challenges. Rivalries, jealousy, and fear reshaped interactions within the crew. Henry Hill observed these dynamics carefully, understanding that minor deviations in behavior could indicate deeper threats. The men involved had to navigate an intricate social landscape where loyalty was fragile and suspicion omnipresent. Every alliance was continually tested, and every action had consequences that could ripple through the organization. The Lufthansa heist, remarkable for its audacity, had also created a permanent climate of caution and strategic thinking. Success, in this context, was defined as much by survival as by the acquisition of wealth. The cultural impact of the Lufthansa heist continued to grow. Its audacity, the meticulous planning, and the sheer scale of the operation captured the imagination of the public and inspired countless retellings in literature and film, most famously in Goodfellas. While these portrayals highlighted the excitement and brilliance of the operation, the true story was far more sobering. The psychological strain, the fear of retribution, and the ever-present threat of violence formed the harsh reality of life in the aftermath. The heist became emblematic of both ambition and risk, offering insight into the complex interplay between human behavior, greed, and survival in the criminal world. Ultimately, the Lufthansa heist revealed the paradoxical nature of success in organized crime. Henry Hill and his associates had achieved what few could even imagine, yet their triumph brought as much peril as reward. The months following the robbery demanded constant vigilance, careful management of money, and acute awareness of human behavior. Every interaction carried risk, and every decision could have fatal consequences. The heist had changed everything. It had reshaped the lives of those involved, altered the operations of the mob, and forever influenced the perception of organized crime in America. Triumph and danger became inseparable companions, and the thin line between audacity and destruction was navigated daily by those who had participated in one of the most legendary robberies in history. Even in the quietest moments, the shadows of that night at JFK Airport lingered. The exhilaration of the heist had long faded, replaced by a relentless vigilance and the acute awareness of constant threats. Henry Hill understood that the story of the Lufthansa heist was not merely one of crime or audacity, it was a lesson in human ambition, loyalty, and survival. It remains a narrative that continues to captivate, offering insight into the delicate balance between success and danger, and the intricate web of decisions, fears, and consequences that defined life in the shadows of organized crime. As the months stretched into years following the Lufthansa heist, the consequence of that audacious robbery became increasingly complex and unavoidable. Henry Hill and his associates were living lives that, on the surface, appeared lavish and successful. Yet beneath that exterior, the tension of survival never waned. The stolen millions had brought luxury, influence, and notoriety, but they had also placed the participants in a precarious position, surrounded by enemies, rival factions, and, most alarmingly, the shadow of their own organization's ruthless enforcement of loyalty. The thrill of the heist had long faded, replaced by a constant state of vigilance and strategic calculation. Every interaction carried weight, every movement could be observed, and every conversation could reveal information with deadly consequences. Managing the vast fortune acquired during the heist required meticulous planning. The money had to be laundered through businesses that could absorb the illicit wealth without attracting attention. Bars, nightclubs, and other front operations became the channels through which the crew converted cash into usable assets. The process was both technically complex and psychologically taxing. Every transaction was weighed against the potential for exposure, whether from law enforcement or from internal scrutiny. Henry Hill recognized that the larger the operation, the greater the attention it would draw. Wealth, while empowering, also brought responsibility and danger. The challenge was not simply in handling the funds, but in navigating the human and legal obstacles surrounding them. Internal trust within the mob became more fragile with each passing day. The men who had once celebrated the heist together now navigated a world in which alliances were tentative and loyalty was constantly tested. Knowledge was a dangerous currency, and those who possessed it had to manage both their own actions and the perceptions of others. Paranoia permeated their daily lives, and even casual interactions could have far-reaching consequences. Henry Hill had to be vigilant, not only in his own behavior, but in interpreting the intentions of others. Survival depended on psychological acuity as much as practical skill, and the very success that had brought them wealth now required extraordinary caution to preserve life and security. The mob's response to the heist was both calculated and ruthless. Leadership recognized that widespread knowledge of the robbery could compromise the organization. Individuals who were considered risks, those possessing too much information, displaying potential disloyalty, or threatening internal stability, were quietly eliminated. Murders and disappearances served both as punishment and as deterrence. For Henry Hill, witnessing these actions reinforced the chilling reality that knowledge itself could be lethal. The environment was one where vigilance and discretion were paramount, and the ability to navigate complex social dynamics was as essential to survival as any practical criminal skill. Meanwhile, law enforcement continued their methodical investigation. The FBI and other federal agencies traced financial transactions, monitored suspects, and gathered intelligence with relentless precision. Although the mob's adherence to omerta provided some protection, human error and fear gradually created vulnerabilities. Investigators exploited these weaknesses, slowly piecing together the intricate network behind the heist. Henry Hill lived under dual pressures, evading legal consequences and avoiding internal retribution. Every decision, no matter how trivial, carried the weight of potential catastrophe. The stakes were life and death, and the environment required constant mental acuity and strategic thinking. Psychological strain became an omnipresent aspect of life in the aftermath of the heist. The excitement and adrenaline of the robbery had been replaced by anxiety, hypervigilance, and fear. Sleep was often elusive, and even mundane activities required careful calculation. Henry Hill understood that the smallest gesture or unguarded word could reveal critical information, putting both him and others at risk. Trust had to be earned, constantly evaluated, and carefully preserved. The psychological landscape was as dangerous as any physical threat, shaping behavior, decisions, and relationships in profound ways. The management of stolen funds demanded extraordinary diligence. Every transfer of money, every attempt to integrate the wealth in legitimate operations required precision and careful oversight. Even minor miscalculations could draw scrutiny from law enforcement or arouse suspicion within the organization. The stolen millions were a symbol of triumph, but they were inseparable from danger. Henry Hill and his peers learned the possession of such wealth was as much a liability as it was a reward. The heist had created opportunities, but it had also transformed their lives into a perpetual negotiation between opportunity and survival. Internal tensions within the crew were inevitable. The combination of fear, jealousy, and mistrust shaped relationships and tested loyalty. Henry Hill observed the subtle signals that indicated potential threats, understanding that even minor deviations in behavior could have significant implications. Alliances were constantly re-evaluated, and actions were carefully measured to avoid suspicion. The successful execution of the Lufthansa heist had created a complex social environment in which survival required not only intelligence and skill but also acute perception and strategic foresight. The line between trust and betrayal was razor-thin, and miscalculations were often fatal. Cultural and historical perspectives on the Lufthansa heist grew alongside its immediate consequences. The story became emblematic of audacity, ambition, and the high stakes of organized crime. Its depiction in popular media, especially the film Goodfellas, highlighted the meticulous planning, courage, and audacity required to pull off such a heist. Yet the dramatizations could not fully convey the human cost, the fear, paranoia, and constant vigilance endured by those involved. The heist is a lesson in human behavior under pressure, illustrating how ambition, greed, and risk interact to shape decisions, alliances, and survival strategies. Ultimately, the Lufthansa heist revealed that in the underworld, success and peril are inseparable. Henry Hill and his associates had achieved a feat of extraordinary intelligence and daring, but their survival required as much strategic foresight as the execution of the robbery itself. Each day was a negotiation between opportunity and danger, loyalty and betrayal, wealth and mortality. The heist had changed everything. It had redefined the operations of the mob, altered the lives of its participants, and forever shaped the perception of organized crime in America. Triumph existed alongside fear, and even the most brilliant criminal endeavors carried with them the seeds of peril. Even in quiet reflection, the shadows of that December night at JFK Airport lingered. The thrill of the heist had long since faded, replaced by strategy, vigilance, and the relentless awareness of danger. Henry Hill understood that the Lufthansa heist was more than a story of criminal audacity. It was a lesson in human ambition, loyalty, and the precarious balance between success and survival. It remains a narrative that continues to captivate audiences, a mesmerizing study of intelligence, grit, fear, and the fine line between triumph and destruction in the shadowed world of organized crime. As the months turned into years after the Lufthansa heist, the reality of what Henry Hill and his associates had undertaken became increasingly clear. The exhilaration of executing one of the most audacious robberies in history was gradually replaced by a relentless awareness of the dangers surrounding every moment of daily life. While the crew had secured millions in cash and valuables, the success of the operation came with consequences that extended far beyond the immediate aftermath of the crime. Every decision, every interaction, and even every casual conversation had the potential to alter the delicate balance between survival and disaster. For Henry Hill, the euphoria of victory had given way to a constant vigilance, a heightened awareness of threat, both external and internal, and the ever-present knowledge that the cost of a mistake could be fatal. The management of the stolen money became a central preoccupation. The crew needed to convert the illicit wealth into usable assets without attracting the attention of law enforcement or sparking conflict within their own ranks. This involved intricate laundering through a network of legitimate businesses, bars, and casinos, each transaction requiring careful coordination and absolute discretion. Even minor errors could have catastrophic consequences, exposing the operation or putting lives at risk. Henry Hill understood that wealth, while a symbol of success, carried a weight of responsibility and danger. The challenge of handling millions of dollars was as much psychological as practical, demanding patience, intelligence, and an acute awareness of human behavior. Internal trust within the mob was increasingly fragile. The heist had placed everyone in a precarious position, where knowledge of the crime could be as dangerous as any weapon. Henry Hill became acutely aware of the subtle ways in which fear, suspicion, and ambition could influence behavior. Conversations were measured, interactions carefully calculated, and loyalty constantly scrutinized. The once straightforward dynamics of friendship and cooperation were now complicated by a pervasive sense of risk. Survival required not only intelligence and skill, but also the ability to read people, anticipate motives, and act with caution. In this environment, psychological acuity was as vital as any practical criminal skill. The mob's response to the heist was both methodical and merciless. Leadership recognized that the wider the knowledge of the operation spread, the greater the risk to the organization. Individuals who were considered potential threats, those with too much information or whose loyalty was in question, were systematically eliminated. Disappearances, murders, and intimidation were employed to maintain control and enforce secrecy. Henry Hill witnessed these actions and internalized the stark reality that knowledge itself could be deadly. The heist had brought fame and wealth, but it had also created a world in which survival depended on a careful navigation of fear, loyalty, and human psychology. The men who had once celebrated together now had to operate in a constant state of alertness, aware that the consequences of any misstep could be irreversible. Meanwhile, law enforcement continued their relentless pursuit of leads. The FBI and other federal agencies meticulously tracked the flow of stolen money, monitored suspects, and used informants to piece together the complex network behind the robbery. The mob's strict adherence to omerta offered some protection, but human error, stress, and fear created vulnerabilities that investigators could exploit. Henry Hill and his associates faced the dual pressures of evading law enforcement while simultaneously avoiding the internal wrath of the mob. Every action carried weight and every decision required foresight. The stakes were nothing less than life and death, and the psychological burden of constant vigilance was profound. The psychological toll of life after the heist was immense. Sleep was often elusive, and even mundane activities became fraught with risk. Henry Hill and the crew were forced to live under a perpetual cloud of suspicion and fear. Relationships were constantly evaluated, and minor deviations in behavior could signal disloyalty or danger. Trust, once a foundation of cooperation, had become a fragile commodity, constantly tested and carefully managed. The exhilaration of the heist had faded, replaced by a careful, calculated approach to every aspect of life, where the smallest misstep could have far-reaching consequences. Managing the stolen money required constant attention. Every transaction, every attempt to integrate the wealth into legitimate channels, demanded careful planning and precision. Mistakes could expose the operation to law enforcement, or trigger conflict within the mob. Henry Hill recognized that the money was both a blessing and a danger, a tool of power, and a source of vulnerability. The challenge of navigating this environment required not only skill and intelligence but also psychological insight, patience, and the ability to anticipate the actions of others. Success was no longer measured simply by the audacity of the heist, it was measured by the ability to survive in its aftermath. Internal dynamics became increasingly complex. Rivalries, jealousy, and mistrust shaped the behavior of everyone involved. Henry Hill had to observe carefully, understanding that even small actions could indicate potential betrayal. Every alliance and relationship was continuously reassessed, every decision weighed against the potential for danger. The successful execution of the Lufthansa heist had created a high-risk social environment where survival depended on perception, strategy, and adaptability. The line between loyalty and betrayal was thin, and miscalculations could prove fatal. The Lufthansa heist's legacy grew beyond the immediate consequences. Its audacity, meticulous planning, and sheer skill captivated the imagination of the public and became a cornerstone of criminal folklore. Films and books, particularly the depiction in Goodfellas, immortalized the story, emphasizing the cleverness and daring of the participants. However, the dramatizations could not convey the psychological strain, fear, and constant vigilance endured by Henry Hill and the others involved. The heist remains a study in ambition, human behavior, and the interplay between risk and reward. It illustrates how the pursuit of wealth and status in a criminal context carries both opportunity and peril in equal measure. Ultimately, the Lufthansa heist highlighted the precarious nature of success in organized crime. Henry Hill and his associates had pulled off one of the most daring robberies in history, yet their triumph carried a continuous threat. Daily life required strategic thinking, careful management of wealth, and acute awareness of the intentions of others. Every moment demanded calculation, every interaction carried potential consequence, and every decision could tip the balance between survival and disaster. The heist had changed everything: the participants' lives, the operation of the mob, and the broader perception of organized crime. Triumph was inseparable from peril, and the delicate balance between audacity and survival defined life after the robbery. Even in quiet reflection, the shadows of that December night at JFK Airport lingered. The adrenaline of the heist had faded, leaving a constant awareness of risk and danger. Henry Hill understood that the Lufthansa heist was more than a crime, it was a lesson in ambition, loyalty, and the fragile balance between success and survival. It remains a narrative that continues to fascinate, offering insight into human behavior, the consequences of audacity, and the intricate web of decisions, fear, and strategy that define life in the criminal underworld. The world Henry Hill inhabited after the Lufthansa heist was one defined by shadows, both literal and figurative. The excitement and thrill of the robbery had long passed, replaced by a life of constant vigilance, strategic maneuvering, and careful calculation. Wealth, once a symbol of triumph, had become a complex burden. Each day presented its own challenges, from managing the stolen millions to navigating the treacherous social dynamics within the mob. For Hill and his associates, the heist was not merely a financial windfall. It was a transformative event that reshaped every aspect of their existence. The consequences of that night at JFK Airport were profound and unrelenting, affecting personal safety, relationships, and the ability to trust even those closest to them. The first and most pressing concern was survival. While law enforcement meticulously pieced together evidence to build a case, the internal repercussions of the heist were often more immediate and lethal. The mob leadership was methodical in its approach, ensuring that those who might compromise the secrecy of the operation were removed or neutralized. Disappearances and murder served as stark reminders of the stakes involved. Knowledge, which had empowered the participants during the heist, now posed a mortal threat. Henry Hill understood that his survival depended not only on avoiding law enforcement scrutiny but also on navigating a world in which the wrong word, gesture, or association could have fatal consequences. Handling the stolen money became an all-consuming task. The millions in cash and valuables required careful laundering to prevent detection and maintain internal stability. The crew relied on a network of legitimate businesses, casinos, and bars to transform illicit funds into usable wealth. Every transaction demanded precision, secrecy, and foresight. The challenges were not purely financial, they were deeply psychological, requiring the participant to balance risk, opportunity, and the unpredictable behaviors of those around them. Wealth had become both a tool and a potential liability, a constant reminder that success in the underworld is never without cost. Internal trust was a delicate and increasingly rare commodity. The men who had pulled off one of the most daring robberies in history now lived under a cloud of suspicion. Fear and ambition complicated every relationship. Conversations were measured, actions carefully observed, and loyalty constantly scrutinized. Henry Hill learned to read subtle cues, understanding that even minor deviations from expected behavior could indicate potential betrayal. Survival depended on psychological insight as much as practical skill, and the success of the heist required constant awareness of both human behavior and external threats. In this environment, trust was not freely given, it had to be earned, maintained, and protected at all costs. The mob's response to the heist underscored the ruthless pragmatism of organized crime. Leadership understood that widespread knowledge of the robbery could jeopardize the organization, and they acted swiftly and decisively. Those suspected of disloyalty or of possessing dangerous knowledge were quietly eliminated. Disappearances and targeted killings served as both punishment and deterrent, reinforcing the need for absolute secrecy. For Henry Hill, witnessing these measures was a sobering reminder that the audacity of the heist brought not only wealth and prestige but also a constant threat to life. Every interaction had to be carefully considered, and every decision carried weighty consequences. Law enforcement continued to close in with relentless precision. The FBI and other federal agencies traced financial transactions, monitored suspects, and used informants to uncover the network behind the heist, while the mob's strict adherence to omerta provided a measure of protection. It could not eliminate the risks created by human error and stress. Henry Hill and his associates were caught in a delicate balance, simultaneously evading legal scrutiny and avoiding internal repercussions. Every action, no matter how mundane, carried the potential to trigger exposure or reprisal. The stakes were a constant reminder of the high cost of participation in such a high-profile crime. Psychological strain became a defining feature of life after the heist. The thrill of the operation had long since faded, replaced by hypervigilance, anxiety, and the weight of constant calculation. Sleep was difficult, and the simplest activities could carry risk. Henry Hill and his peers had to live under an unrelenting sense of threat, assessing trustworthiness, loyalty, and the potential for betrayal in every encounter. Even casual interactions were fraught with tension. Trust was scarce, and the knowledge of what had been stolen only heightened the dangers inherent in the social landscape of the mob. The management of the stolen funds required both skill and psychological resilience. Every attempt to launder money, integrate wealth, and maintain operational security demanded extraordinary foresight. Minor mistakes could have severe consequences, exposing both individuals and the organization to investigation or internal retribution. Henry Hill understood that the money was inseparable from danger, a tool of power that required careful handling to ensure survival. The heist had created opportunity, but it had also introduced a perpetual and intense pressure that shaped daily life in ways that extended far beyond the immediate aftermath of the robbery. Internal dynamics within the crew were increasingly strained. Jealousy, fear, and mistrust influenced decisions and behavior. Henry Hill observed the subtle cues that indicated shifting alliances and potential threats. Understanding that even the smallest action could have deadly consequences, the Lufthansa heist, once celebrated as a pinnacle of audacity, had transformed the environment into one where survival depended as much on reading people as on any technical skill. The thin line between loyalty and betrayal dictated the rhythm of life, forcing constant vigilance and careful management of relationships. The cultural resonance of the Lufthansa heist continued to grow. Its meticulous planning, audacity, and skill captivated the imagination of audiences in both literature and film, particularly in the story immortalized in Goodfellas. While popular portrayals emphasized excitement and cleverness, the reality was far more sobering. The psychological strain, fear, and constant threat of violence were an inescapable part of life for Henry Hill and his associates. The heist remains a profound study of human behavior, illustrating the delicate interplay between ambition, risk, and consequence. It demonstrates how wealth and status in the criminal world are inseparable from danger, and how survival depends on intelligence, foresight, and constant strategic thinking. Ultimately, the Lufthansa heist exemplified the paradox of criminal success. The men who executed it had demonstrated extraordinary audacity, skill, yet their triumph carried an ongoing and inescapable peril. Daily life became a negotiation between opportunity and danger, trust and suspicion, wealth and mortality. Every action was a calculated decision, and every day brought new risks. The heist had changed everything, shaping the lives of its participants, operations of the mob, and the perception of organized crime in America. Triumph existed alongside fear, and every step forward required careful navigation of a treacherous landscape where the margin for error was razor thin. Even in moments of quiet reflection, the memory of that night at JFK Airport remained vivid. The adrenaline, excitement, and brilliance of the heist had long since faded, leaving a world defined by vigilance, strategy, and the constant awareness of danger. Henry Hill understood that the Lufthansa heist was not merely a story of crime, it was a profound lesson in ambition, human behavior, and the precarious balance between audacity and survival. The tale continues to captivate, offering insight into the risks, rewards, and psychological realities of life in the shadowed corridors of organized crime. In the years following the Lufthansa heist, Henry Hill and the men involved found themselves living in a world where every day was a delicate negotiation between opportunity and peril. The immediate thrill of the robbery had long since faded, replaced by a constant awareness of the consequences that success had unleashed. The stolen millions, once the symbol of their audacious triumph, became a source of tension, responsibility, and risk. Each interaction, whether with law enforcement, fellow criminals, or associates, required careful calculation. Every action could trigger suspicion, betrayal, or violence. The heist, which had elevated their status within the underworld, had also introduced a persistent and profound danger that could not be escaped. Handling the enormous sums of money became an intricate and high-stakes endeavor. The cash and valuables stolen from Lufthansa needed to be laundered, converted into assets that could be used without drawing attention from authorities or arousing the jealousy and suspicion of other mob members. Bars, clubs, and legitimate businesses became channels through which the crew moved funds, each transaction requiring precision, discretion, and foresight. Even minor mistakes could have catastrophic consequences. Henry Hill understood that wealth, while the reward for their audacity was inseparable from risk, it was not just money. It was a constant reminder that their success had made them both powerful and vulnerable. Internal trust within the mob became increasingly scarce. The heist had placed everyone involved in a precarious position. Knowledge was dangerous. Those who had been closest during the planning and execution were now wary of one another. Conversations were measured, actions carefully observed, and alliances continually evaluated. Henry Hill had to navigate a complex social landscape where loyalty was fragile and betrayal could be lethal. Survival depended on his ability to read subtle cues, anticipate motives, and act with discretion. The skills that had enabled him to pull off one of the most daring robberies in history now had to be applied to the everyday challenge of living in its shadow. The mob's response to the heist was swift and merciless. Leadership understood that widespread knowledge of the operation was a liability. Individuals suspected of possessing dangerous information or displaying signs of disloyalty were systematically eliminated. Disappearances and targeted killings served as warnings to others, reinforcing the critical importance of secrecy. Henry Hill witnessed these measures and internalized the harsh reality that audacity and brilliance in execution did not guarantee safety afterward. The heist had brought wealth and notoriety, but it had also introduced a constant and inescapable threat to life itself. Every decision, every gesture, Every word had consequences that could be fatal. Meanwhile, law enforcement pursued leads with relentless determination. The FBI and other federal agencies monitored transactions, traced financial patterns, and relied on informants to piece together the complex network behind the robbery. While the mob's strict adherence to omerta provided some insulation, fear, stress, and human error slowly created vulnerability. Henry Hill and his associates lived under dual pressures, avoiding prosecution by authorities and avoiding internal retribution from the mob. The stakes were unrelenting, and survival required vigilance, intelligence, and constant strategic thinking. Even minor lapses in judgment could set in motion events that might endanger their lives or their freedom. The psychological burden of life after the heist was immense. The adrenaline that had once driven the robbery had long dissipated, leaving behind a constant tension, hypervigilance, and anxiety. Sleep became elusive, and even routine activities were fraught with risk. Henry Hill had to evaluate the intentions of those around him constantly, recognizing that subtle cues could indicate potential betrayal or danger. Trust was scarce and had to be continuously assessed. Every day was a test of judgment, perception, and survival instincts, requiring a level of awareness that could be exhausting. The heist, in all its brilliance, had transformed their lives into a relentless negotiation between risk and reward. Managing the stolen funds required a combination of financial acumen and psychological insight. Every attempt to move or launder money demanded careful planning to avoid law enforcement attention and prevent disputes within the organization. Henry Hill recognized that wealth was inseparable from danger. The stolen millions symbolized both opportunity and threat. Success was no longer measured solely by the execution of the heist, but by the ability to survive and maintain control over the resources acquired. Every financial decision was calculated with precision, as any misstep could draw scrutiny or provoke retaliation. The internal dynamics of the crew were further complicated by jealousy, ambition, and fear. Even among those who had participated in the robbery, alliances shifted subtly over time. Henry Hill had to observe these changes with acute awareness, understanding that even minor behavioral deviations could indicate serious consequences. The Lufthansa heist, while a crowning achievement of audacity and intelligence, had created a highly precarious social environment in which survival required as much skill in reading human behavior as it did in executing criminal operations. Loyalty was fragile, and miscalculations could be deadly. Cultural fascination with the Lufthansa heist grew alongside its immediate and long-term consequences. The scale, audacity, and meticulous planning captured the imagination of the public and became a touchstone for depictions of organized crime. Films, books, and documentaries celebrated the cleverness and daring of the participants, particularly through the lens of Goodfellas. Yet the dramatizations could not fully convey the psychological strain endured by Henry Hill and his peers, the fear, paranoia, and constant need for vigilance that had become their everyday reality. The story endures because it illustrates the delicate interplay between ambition, risk, and consequence in a high-stakes criminal environment. Ultimately, the Lufthansa heist demonstrated the paradoxical nature of criminal success. The men who executed it achieved a level of audacity and brilliance few could imagine. Yet their triumph came with ongoing and inescapable peril. Life after the robbery required careful management of money, strategic navigation of relationships, and constant awareness of both human behavior and external threats. Each decision carried consequences, and the margin for error was vanishingly small. The heist had reshaped the participants' lives, the operations of the mob, and the broader perception of organized crime. Triumph and danger were inseparable, and even the most brilliant criminal endeavors carried within them the seeds of danger and uncertainty. Even in quiet reflection, the memory of that December night at JFK Airport remained vivid. The thrill and brilliance of the heist had long faded, leaving a world defined by vigilance, strategy, and the persistent awareness of danger. Henry Hill understood that the Lufthansa heist was more than a criminal act. It was a study in ambition, human behavior, loyalty, and the precarious balance between audacity and survival. Its lessons endure, offering insight into the consequences of high-stakes crime and the psychological realities of living in the shadow of one of the most audacious robberies in history. The aftermath of the Lufthansa heist continued to unfold in ways that Henry Hill and his associates could never have fully anticipated. The initial thrill of the operation had long since subsided, replaced by the unrelenting pressures of survival, secrecy, and constant vigilance. While millions of dollars had been secured in the daring robbery, the true cost of that success was measured not in dollars, but in anxiety, fear, and the painstaking calculations required to navigate life after the heist. The men involved had learned that triumph in the criminal world was always accompanied by risk, and that even the most carefully executed operations could produce consequences that lingered far beyond the moment of accomplishment. The management of the stolen funds became a central concern, as the crew sought to integrate the wealth into legitimate channels without drawing the attention of law enforcement or arousing suspicion within the mob. Bars, nightclubs, and other businesses provided avenues for money laundering, but each transaction carried the weight of potential exposure. Henry Hill understood that wealth, while symbolizing success, also attracted scrutiny and envy. Every financial decision had to be weighed carefully, balancing opportunity against risk, and constantly monitoring both internal and external threats. The money was both a tool and a trap, and the men involved navigated its complexities with painstaking care. Internal trust within the mob was increasingly fragile. The men who had once celebrated the audacity of the heist now existed in a world where knowledge could be lethal, and loyalty was continually tested. Conversations were measured, alliances carefully scrutinized, and behavior constantly observed. Henry Hill became adept at reading subtle cues, understanding that even minor deviations from expected conduct could signal potential betrayal or danger. Survival required not only intelligence and skill, but also a deep understanding of human psychology, as the line between friend and foe became increasingly blurred. In this environment, the skills that had enabled them to execute the heist were now repurposed for navigating a complex web of fear, suspicion, and ambition. The mob's response to the heist reflected both discipline and ruthlessness. Leadership recognized that widespread knowledge of the operation posed a direct threat to the organization. Individuals suspected of disloyalty or of possessing too much information were quietly removed from the equation. Disappearances, beatings, and targeted killings reinforced the importance of secrecy and served as warnings to others. For Henry Hill, witnessing these events was a chilling reminder that knowledge, which had been a source of power during the heist, could now be deadly. The environment required constant vigilance, careful observation, and strategic decision-making to navigate safely. Every interaction carried potential consequences, and missteps could be fatal. Meanwhile, law enforcement continued their methodical pursuit of the individuals involved. The FBI and other federal agencies traced the movement of stolen funds, monitored suspects, and relied on informants to piece together the complex network behind the robbery. While the mob's strict code of silence offered some protection, it could not eliminate the vulnerability introduced by fear, human error, and the psychological pressures of life after the heist. Henry Hill and his associates faced the dual challenge of evading prosecution while simultaneously managing internal threats, a combination that demanded constant strategic thinking, observation, and awareness. The psychological burden of life after the heist was immense. The adrenaline and thrill of the operation had faded, replaced by hypervigilance, anxiety, and constant calculation. Sleep was often elusive, and routine activities became fraught with potential danger. Henry Hill learned that trust was a precious and fragile commodity, one that had to be earned and carefully managed. Relationships were continuously evaluated, and even minor deviations in behavior could indicate serious risks. The heist, once celebrated for its audacity, had transformed daily life into a delicate balance between risk and survival, where every decision carried profound implications. Managing the stolen money required both technical skill and psychological insight. Each transaction and attempt to integrate the wealth into legitimate businesses had to be carefully monitored to prevent exposure or internal conflict. The millions acquired in the heist were not merely cash. They represented both opportunity and risk, a constant reminder that the success of the operation had introduced a permanent and pervasive danger. Henry Hill understood that the ability to preserve and manage this wealth was as crucial to survival as the planning and execution of the heist itself. The stakes were relentless, and even minor mistakes could have serious consequences. Internal dynamics within the crew were complicated by fear, jealousy, and ambition. Alliances shifted subtly, and the social environment became increasingly precarious. Henry Hill observed these changes with careful attention, aware that misreading the intentions of others could be deadly. The Lufthansa heist, while a triumph of planning and audacity, had created a world where human behavior, loyalty, and strategic thinking dictated survival. Every interaction required calculation, every gesture carried meaning, and every decision could tip the balance between safety and peril. Success had transformed into an ongoing negotiation with danger at every turn. The Lufthansa heist also solidified its place in cultural history. Its scale, audacity, and meticulous execution captured the imagination of the public and became emblematic of organized crime in America. Films, books, and documentaries, especially Goodfellas, dramatized the cleverness and daring of those involved, highlighting the suspense and risk inherent in the operation. Yet the psychological realities, the fear, the paranoia, and the unrelenting tension of life after the robbery were aspects of the story that dramatizations could not fully convey. The heist remains a study in human behavior, risk, and consequence, illustrating how wealth, ambition, and survival intertwine in the criminal world. Ultimately, the Lufthansa heist underscored the paradox of criminal success. Henry Hill and his associates had achieved a feat of remarkable skill and audacity, yet their triumph brought ongoing, unavoidable peril. Life after the robbery required careful management of money, strategic navigation of relationships, and acute awareness of both human and institutional threats. Every decision carried consequences, and the margin for error was minima. The heist had reshaped the participants' lives, the operations of the mob, and the broader perception of organized crime. Triumph and danger became inseparable, and each day required a careful balance of audacity and prudence. Even in moments of quiet reflection, the memory of that December night at JFK Airport remained vivid. The exhilaration, brilliance, and audacity of the heist had faded, replaced by strategy, vigilance, and the persistent awareness of danger. Henry Hill understood that the Lufthansa heist was more than a story of crime. It was a lesson in ambition, human behavior, loyalty, and the delicate balance between risk and survival. Its legacy endures, offering insight into the psychological realities of life in the underworld, the consequence of audacity, and the enduring tension between wealth and danger in the shadowed world of organized crime. In the years that followed the Lufthansa heist, Henry Hill's life became a careful balancing act, a world in which success and peril were intertwined so tightly that neither could exist without the other. The adrenaline-fueled excitement of pulling off one of the most audacious robberies in history had faded, leaving a life dominated by vigilance, strategy, and the constant calculation of risk. Every day, Henry Hill and the men involved in the heist were reminded that triumph in the criminal world came with consequences that could be immediate and irreversible. The stolen millions, which had seemed like the ultimate reward, were simultaneously a source of wealth, influence, and persistent danger, creating a delicate web of responsibility, fear, and opportunity. The handling and management of the stolen funds was both a practical necessity and a psychological burden. The money needed to be laundered through a network of legitimate businesses, casinos, and nightclubs, each transaction carefully orchestrated to avoid scrutiny from law enforcement while also preventing suspicion or jealousy within the mob. Each step required meticulous planning, foresight, and absolute discretion. Henry Hill understood that even the smallest miscalculation could have catastrophic consequences, and the weight of that awareness became an inescapable part of daily life. Wealth, while representing success, was inseparable from risk and demanded constant vigilance. Trust within the mob became an increasingly rare and fragile commodity. The men who had celebrated together after the heist now operated under a cloud of suspicion, fear, and subtle rivalry. Knowledge was a dangerous asset. Those who possessed too much information were considered liabilities. Conversations were carefully measured, alliances continuously evaluated, and behavior constantly observed for signs of betrayal or instability. Henry Hill developed a keen sense of observation, able to detect subtle shifts in behavior and anticipate potential threats. Survival required more than intelligence or cunning. It demanded psychological insight, strategic thinking, and the ability to navigate a complex web of human relationships. The mob's response to the heist was calculated and ruthless. Leadership understood that widespread knowledge of the robbery could jeopardize the entire organization, and they acted decisively to remove any perceived threats. Disappearances, targeted killings, and intimidation were employed to maintain order and enforce loyalty. For Henry Hill, witnessing these measures served as a stark reminder of the dangerous realities of life in organized crime. Knowledge that had once been empowering now carried lethal consequences, and every action, word, or decision had the potential to provoke retaliation or punishment. Survival required careful attention to both internal dynamics and external threats. Law enforcement, relentless in its pursuit, continued to piece together the events surrounding the Lufthansa heist. The FBI and other federal agencies meticulously traced financial movements, monitored associates, and used informants to penetrate the organized structure behind the robbery. While the mob's code of silence offered some protection, human error, stress, and fear gradually created vulnerabilities. Henry Hill and his associates were forced to live under constant scrutiny from two directions: the law and the very organization that had orchestrated the heist. Every step, every interaction, and every decision required a careful weighing of risk, consequence, and potential gain. Psychological strain dominated life after the robbery. The thrill and adrenaline that had driven the heist had long vanished, replaced by tension, anxiety, and an ever-present awareness of danger. Sleep was often disrupted, and even the most ordinary tasks carried the potential for serious consequences. Henry Hill learned that trust was a rare and valuable asset, one that could not be taken for granted. Relationships were constantly evaluated, Minor changes in behavior carefully scrutinized, and every decision was weighed for potential risk. The world created by the Lufthansa heist was one in which vigilance was a constant necessity, and survival depended as much on reading human behavior as it did on skill or intelligence. Managing the stolen wealth required not only practical skill, but also psychological resilience. Each attempt to move funds or integrate them into legitimate channels demanded careful consideration, attention to detail, and strategic foresight. Henry Hill realized that the millions stolen in the heist were inseparable from the dangers they carried. The money was a tool of power and influence, yet it also drew scrutiny, jealousy, and potential violence. Success was no longer measured solely by the audacity of the crime itself, but by the ability to maintain control, avoid exposure, and navigate the treacherous environment that success had created. Internal dynamics within the crew became increasingly strained over time. Ambition, fear, and jealousy subtly influenced relationships and behavior, forcing Henry Hill to constantly monitor his surroundings and reassess his alliances. Even minor actions or gestures could indicate potential betrayal or instability, making life a continuous exercise in observation and calculation. The Lufthansa heist, celebrated for its audacity, had transformed their social environment into one in which the ability to read and respond to human behavior was just as critical to survival as any practical skill. Loyalty was fragile, and missteps could carry deadly consequences. The cultural impact of the Lufthansa heist continued to grow. Its meticulous planning, scale, and audacity captured public fascination and became a cornerstone of organized crime history. Books, films, and documentaries, particularly the portrayal in Goodfellas, highlighted the cleverness and daring of those involved. However, the dramatizations could not fully convey the psychological toll of living under constant threat, the fear of betrayal, and the persistent vigilance that defined life in the aftermath. The heist remains a compelling study of ambition, human behavior, and the interplay of risk, reward, and consequence in the shadowed world of organized crime. Ultimately, the Lufthansa heist demonstrated the inextricable link between success and peril in organized crime. Henry Hill and his associates had pulled off one of the most daring robberies in history, but their triumph came with an ongoing and pervasive danger. Survival demanded the careful management of money, meticulous attention to relationship, and constant awareness of both internal and external threats. Every decision carried significant consequences, and even the smallest misstep could tip the balance between safety and disaster. The heist reshaped lives, redefined mob operations, and left an enduring mark on the perception of organized crime in America. Triumph and danger were forever intertwined, and the men who had participated learned that the cost of audacity extended far beyond the act itself. Even in moments of quiet reflection, the memory of that night at JFK Airport remained vivid. The brilliance, audacity, and thrill of the heist had long faded, replaced by careful planning, vigilance, and constant awareness of the dangers surrounding every decision. Henry Hill understood that the Lufthansa heist was more than a story of crime. It was a study in ambition, loyalty, human behavior, and the precarious balance between success and survival. Its lessons endure, offering insight into the psychological realities of life after audacious crime and the inescapable consequences of operating in the shadowed world of organized crime. As time passed after the Lufthansa heist, Henry Hill found that the initial exhilaration of success had been replaced by an unrelenting pressure that permeated every aspect of daily life. Heist, which had brought millions in stolen cash and valuables, also brought with it a world defined by constant vigilance, careful calculation, and the ever-present threat of danger. The adrenaline and excitement of the robbery had long faded, leaving a reality in which the greatest challenge was survival itself. Every step forward, every decision, and every interaction carried consequences that could be catastrophic if misjudged. The stolen millions, once a symbol of audacious triumph, had transformed into a source of tension, responsibility, and profound risk. Managing the stolen wealth became a complex and consuming task. Henry Hill and his associates needed to launder the funds through a network of legitimate businesses, casinos, and clubs, ensuring that the money could be accessed and used without attracting the scrutiny of law enforcement or provoking suspicion within the mob. Each transaction demanded careful planning, foresight, and discretion. One misstep could lead to exposure, and exposure could lead to legal action or violent retaliation. Wealth, while empowering, also imposed a relentless burden. The men involved had to maintain constant awareness of both practical and psychological risks associated with handling such vast sums. Internal trust within the mob became increasingly precarious. The men who had once celebrated the heist together now lived in a world where knowledge could be fatal and loyalty was continually questioned. Conversations were measured, behavior carefully monitored, and alliances continuously reassessed. Henry Hill honed his ability to interpret subtle cues, recognizing that even minor deviations in behavior could indicate danger. Survival depended as much on understanding human behavior as it did on financial skill or street smarts. The environment created by the Lufthansa heist demanded psychological acuity, strategic thinking, and constant vigilance to navigate the precarious social landscape. The mob's response to the heist was both disciplined and ruthless. Leadership understood that the more people knew about the operation, the greater the risk to the organization. Individuals suspected of disloyalty or possessing dangerous information were quietly removed from the equation. Disappearances and targeted killings served as warnings to others, enforcing the imperative of secrecy. For Henry Hill, witnessing these measures underscored the perilous nature of success in organized crime. Knowledge that had once been a source of power had become a lethal liability. Every interaction, every decision, and even casual conversation could carry consequences that were irreversible. Law enforcement remained a constant and relentless threat. The FBI and other federal agencies pursued leads, monitored suspects, and analyzed financial transactions to reconstruct the network behind the robbery. While the mob's adherence to omerta provided some measure of protection, it could not eliminate the vulnerabilities introduced by fear, stress, and human error. Henry Hill and his associates were constantly forced to navigate a dual threat, evading prosecution while avoiding internal retribution. Each step in daily life required careful assessment of risk, as even seemingly minor actions could attract scrutiny or provoke violent retaliation. The psychological strain of life after the heist was immense. The excitement and adrenaline of the robbery had long since disappeared, replaced by heightened awareness, anxiety, and the persistent need for vigilance. Sleep was often disrupted, and even routine activities carried potential danger. Henry Hill understood that trust had become a rare and fragile commodity, one that had to be earned and carefully maintained. Relationships were constantly evaluated, and minor behavioral deviations could signify serious threats. The world created by the Lufthansa heist was one where survival depended on the ability to constantly assess risk, read human behavior, and anticipate the actions of others. Handling the stolen money required both skill and psychological resilience. Each attempt to move funds or integrate wealth into legitimate channels demanded careful planning and attention to detail. The stolen millions were both a symbol of triumph and a source of vulnerability. Success was no longer measured simply by the audacity of the heist. It was measured by the ability to survive, maintain control, and avoid exposure. Henry Hill realized that the wealth acquired was inseparable from danger, and that every financial decision carried consequences that could ripple through both law enforcement investigations and internal mob dynamics. Internal dynamics among the crew became increasingly complex over time. Ambition, fear, and jealousy subtly influenced decisions and behavior. Henry Hill observed these changes with care, understanding that misreading the intentions of others could be deadly. The Lufthansa heist, celebrated for its brilliance and audacity, had created a world in which human behavior, perception, and strategy determined survival. Every interaction required calculation, every gesture carried meaning, and every decision could influence whether an individual remained safe or faced lethal consequences. Loyalty was fragile, and missteps could provoke catastrophic outcomes. The Lufthansa heist's legacy extended beyond immediate consequences. Its audacity, meticulous planning, and scale captured public fascination, making it a defining moment in the history of organized crime. Books, films, and documentaries, particularly the portrayal in Goodfellas, celebrated the cleverness and daring of the participants. Yet the dramatizations could never fully convey the psychological realities that Henry Hill and his associates faced. The constant fear, paranoia, and unrelenting need for vigilance that shaped every aspect of life after the robbery. The heist remains a vivid study of ambition, human behavior, and the interaction of risk, reward, and consequence in the criminal underworld. Ultimately, the Lufthansa heist exemplified the inseparable link between success and danger in organized crime. Henry Hill and his associates had achieved a feat few could imagine, yet their triumph carried a continuous and pervasive threat. Survival required careful management of money, strategic navigation, relationships, and acute awareness of both internal and external risks. Every decision had consequences, and even minor errors could have life-altering results. The heist reshaped the participants' lives, the operations of the mob, and the broader understanding of organized crime in America. Triumph and danger existed together, inseparable, and every day demanded a careful balance of skill, strategy, and awareness. Even in quiet moments, the memory of that night at JFK Airport remained vivid. The thrill, brilliance, and audacity of the heist had faded, replaced by meticulous planning, constant vigilance, and acute awareness of ever-present danger. Henry Hill understood that the Lufthansa heist was more than a story of crime. It was a profound lesson in ambition, human behavior, loyalty, and the delicate balance between success and survival. Its legacy continues, offering insight into the psychological realities of high-stakes criminal activity, the consequence of audacity, and the enduring tension between wealth and danger in the shadowed corridors of organized crime. In the years following the Lufthansa heist, life for Henry Hill and the men involved became an intricate dance between audacity, survival, and constant vigilance. The initial euphoria of executing one of the most daring robberies in American history had long faded, replaced by the relentless demands of living with the consequences. The millions of dollars stolen from JFK Airport were more than just wealth. They were a symbol of triumph, a source of power, and simultaneously a perpetual reminder of danger. Every day required careful planning, measured actions, and acute awareness of both internal and external threats. For Henry Hill, the reality of the heist extended far beyond the brief excitement of execution into a world where every decision carried weighty consequences. The management of the stolen money was a constant preoccupation. Millions in cash and valuables could not simply be stored or spent without consideration. The crew relied on a network of businesses, bars, clubs, and other legitimate operations to launder the money and convert it into usable assets. Each transaction was executed with extreme caution to avoid law enforcement scrutiny and prevent disputes within the mob. Henry Hill quickly realized that wealth, while a sign of success, also attracted attention, envy, and danger. Every financial move required foresight and precision. The very success of the heist became intertwined with a meticulous strategy for managing the stolen funds, a task that demanded both skill and psychological resilience. Internal trust within the mob had grown increasingly fragile. Men who had once shared camaraderie during the planning and execution of the heist now lived in a world governed by fear, suspicion, and subtle rivalry. Knowledge was deadly, and the possession of information could make someone a target. Henry Hill became hyper-aware of behavioral nuances, learning to read the intentions of others and anticipate potential threats. Survival demanded psychological acuity as much as practical skill. The social environment had become a precarious one, where alliances were tentative, and even the smallest misstep could trigger lethal consequences. Understanding human behavior and maintaining strategic discretion were now as essential as any tactical skill used during the heist itself. The mob's response to the Lufthansa heist was systematic and ruthless. Leadership recognized the need to maintain secrecy at all costs. Individuals who were suspected of disloyalty or who possessed knowledge that could compromise the organization were quietly eliminated. Disappearances, targeted killings, and intimidation became tools of enforcement, reinforcing the culture of secrecy. For Henry Hill, witnessing these actions reinforced the understanding that audacity and intelligence alone could not guarantee safety. Knowledge that had empowered them during the heist now carried the weight of potential death. Every conversation, every movement, and every decision became a matter of survival, demanding careful calculation and awareness of shifting dynamics. Meanwhile, law enforcement continued their relentless investigation. The FBI and other federal agencies monitored transactions, traced financial flows, and gathered intelligence from informants. While the mob's code of silence provided a shield, it could not eliminate vulnerabilities that arose from stress, human error, and fear. Henry Hill and his associates were forced to operate under dual pressure, evading prosecution while avoiding the wrath of their own organization. Every interaction was fraught with risk, and even seemingly mundane decisions could have far-reaching consequences. The stakes were unrelenting, and each day demanded constant vigilance and strategic thinking. Psychological strain became an inescapable aspect of life after the heist. The thrill of the robbery had faded, leaving anxiety, hypervigilance, and a perpetual awareness of danger as constant companions. Sleep became elusive, and even ordinary activities could harbor hidden risks. Trust, once a foundation for cooperation, became a rare and fragile commodity. Relationships had to be carefully evaluated, and minor shifts in behavior could signal threats that were both subtle and deadly. The environment created by the Lufthansa heist transformed life into a continual assessment of risk, loyalty, and the unpredictable nature of human behavior. Handling the stolen funds required a combination of practical skill and acute psychological insight. Every attempt to move, launder, or invest the money demanded meticulous attention and foresight. The millions stolen were inseparable from the risks they carried. Wealth was both an asset and a vulnerability, offering influence and freedom while simultaneously exposing the participants to scrutiny, envy, and potential violence. For Henry Hill, the success of the heist was now inseparable from the challenge of managing its ongoing consequences. Survival depended on precision, discretion, and the ability to anticipate both internal and external threats. Internal dynamics within the crew became increasingly fraught over time. Fear, ambition, and jealousy subtly shaped decisions and behavior. Henry Hill had to observe every interaction with care, understanding that even small deviations could indicate risk. The Lufthansa heist, while celebrated for its audacity, had created an environment in which human behavior, perception, and strategic thinking determined survival. Every conversation, gesture, and action carried weight. Loyalty was fragile, and the margin for error was razor thin. The consequences of misjudgment could be fatal, reinforcing the constant vigilance necessary for life after the robbery. The cultural significance of the Lufthansa heist continued to grow. Its meticulous planning, audacity, and scope captured the public imagination and became emblematic of organized crime. Films, books, and documentaries, particularly Goodfellas, highlighted the daring and intelligence of those involved. Yet dramatizations could not fully capture the psychological strain endured by Henry Hill and his associates. The fear, paranoia, and constant need for vigilance that shaped life in the aftermath. The story endures because it illuminates human behavior under extreme pressure, the tension between ambition and survival, and the delicate balance between reward and risk in the criminal world. Ultimately, the Lufthansa heist underscored the inescapable link between success and danger. Henry Hill and his associates had achieved a feat of brilliance and audacity, yet their triumph carried ongoing, persistent risk. Survival required careful money management, strategic navigation of relationships, and constant awareness of potential threats. Every decision carried consequences, and even minor errors could have life-altering effects. The heist reshaped individual lives, the operations of the mob, and the broader understanding of organized crime. Triumph and peril existed together, inseparable, and every day demanded a careful balance of strategy, foresight, and prudence. Even in moments of quiet reflection, the events of that December night at JFK Airport remained vivid in memory. The thrill, audacity, and brilliance of the heist had faded, replaced by vigilance, strategic calculation, and awareness of ever-present danger. Henry Hill understood that the Lufthansa heist was not merely a story of criminal daring, it was a lesson in ambition, human behavior, loyalty, and the delicate balance between audacity and survival. Its lessons endure, providing insight into the realities of high-stakes crime, the consequences of audacity, and the unrelenting tension between wealth and risk in the shadowed world of organized crime. As the years passed, the consequences of the Lufthansa heist weighed more heavily on Henry Hill and the men involved than the heist itself. The audacious robbery, which had once symbolized power, skill, and ingenuity, became a defining force in their lives, shaping every decision, every interaction, and every thought. The stolen millions, while offering wealth and status, also served as a relentless reminder of danger, betrayal, and the fragility of survival in the world of organized crime. For Henry Hill, the thrill and adrenaline of the night at JFK Airport had long faded, replaced by a life defined by vigilance, calculation, and the constant navigation of threats that lurked in both familiar and unexpected places. The management of the stolen funds remained an all-consuming endeavor. Every attempt to launder money through bars, clubs, and legitimate businesses required meticulous planning to avoid scrutiny by law enforcement and prevent conflict within the mob. Each transaction was executed with precision and discretion, understanding that even minor mistakes could trigger serious consequences. Henry Hill knew that the money, while representing triumph and freedom, also attracted attention, envy, and potential violence. Wealth became a double-edged sword, a source of empowerment intertwined with a perpetual threat that demanded constant vigilance and strategic thinking. Internal trust within the organization had been irrevocably altered by the heist. The camaraderie that had once bound the crew together gave way to suspicion, fear, and subtle rivalry. Knowledge was power but also liability, and those who possessed too much information could become targets. Henry Hill honed his ability to interpret minute behavioral cues, recognizing that even a small gesture or deviation in demeanor could signal danger. Survival required more than intelligence or skill. It required a deep understanding of human behavior, careful observation, and the ability to anticipate the motives of others. In this environment, psychological insight became just as critical as practical experience in navigating the treacherous social landscape of organized crime. The mob's response to the Lufthansa heist remained calculated and merciless. Leadership acted decisively to neutralize any perceived threats, employing disappearance, targeted killings, and intimidation to reinforce secrecy and loyalty. Henry Hill observed these actions, internalizing the brutal reality that audacity alone could not guarantee safety. Knowledge that had empowered them during the heist had become a dangerous liability. Every action, conversation, or association could carry life or death consequences. The world Henry Hill inhabited was one in which constant vigilance, discretion, and strategic foresight were essential for survival. Law enforcement continued its persistent pursuit, analyzing transactions, tracing the movement of money, and cultivating informants to reconstruct the complex network behind the robbery. While the code of silence provided some protection, it could not eliminate the vulnerability introduced by human error, fear, and the pressures of life after the heist. Henry Hill and his associates were perpetually caught between the threat of legal prosecution and internal retribution from the mob. Every movement had to be carefully considered, and every interaction evaluated for potential risk. The psychological demands of this reality were immense, requiring constant awareness and calculation to avoid disaster. The psychological toll of living in the aftermath of the heist was profound. The thrill of the robbery had long since dissipated, replaced by anxiety, hypervigilance, and the relentless awareness of danger. Sleep was frequently interrupted, and even routine tasks could present unforeseen risks. Trust, once a foundation for cooperation, became a rare and valuable commodity. Relationships had to be continuously evaluated, and minor changes in behavior could indicate serious threats. The environment created by the Lufthansa heist transformed life into an ongoing assessment of risk, loyalty, and human behavior, where survival depended on an acute understanding of both self and others. Managing the stolen wealth required a combination of financial skill, strategic foresight, and psychological resilience. Each effort to move or invest money carried the potential for exposure, internal conflict, or law enforcement attention. The stolen millions were inseparable from the risks they represented. Wealth was both a tool and a trap, offering influence, power, and the illusion of freedom, while simultaneously drawing scrutiny, jealousy, and potential danger. Henry Hill realized that survival depended not only on careful management of resources but also on constant awareness of shifting dynamics within the organization and the wider criminal landscape. The internal dynamics of the crew were increasingly fraught. Ambition, fear, and jealousy subtly shaped interactions, requiring Henry Hill to constantly monitor the intentions and behaviors of those around him. Even small gestures or changes in tone could signal shifts in loyalty or potential threats. The Lufthansa heist, celebrated for its audacity and meticulous planning, had created a social environment in which the ability to read human behavior and act strategically became essential for survival. Every word, action, and decision carried weight, and misjudgments could have deadly consequences. Loyalty was fragile, and the margin for error was narrow. The cultural impact of the Lufthansa heist endured. Its audacity, scale, and meticulous execution captivated public imagination and became emblematic of organized crime in America. Films, books, and documentaries, particularly Goodfellas, immortalized the story, celebrating the cleverness and daring of those involved. Yet these dramatizations could not capture the full psychological reality, the fear, paranoia, and constant vigilance that defined life in the aftermath. The heist remains a vivid study in ambition, risk, and human behavior, illustrating the precarious balance between reward and danger in the criminal world and offering insight into the pressures that accompany audacious acts. Ultimately, the Lufthansa heist underscored the inseparable link between success and danger. Henry Hill and his associates had executed a crime of remarkable skill and audacity, yet their triumph carried persistent, inescapable risks. Survival required careful money management, strategic assessment of relationship, and constant vigilance against internal and external threats. Every decision had consequences, and even minor missteps could have life-altering effects. The heist reshaped the participants' lives, the operations of the mob, and the broader perception of organized crime. Triumph and peril coexisted, intertwined, and every day demanded a careful balance of audacity, strategy, and foresight. Even in reflective moments, the memory of that night at JFK Airport remained vivid. The thrill, ingenuity, and audacity of the heist had long since faded, replaced by meticulous calculation, vigilance, and a keen awareness of danger. Henry Hill understood that the Lufthansa heist was more than a tale of crime. It was a study in ambition, loyalty, human psychology, and the delicate equilibrium between daring and survival. Its lessons endure, offering insight into the realities of high-stakes criminal activity, the consequences of audacity, and the unrelenting tension between wealth and risk in the shadowed corridors of organized crime. The story of the Lufthansa heist stands as a reminder that even the most brilliant criminal acts come at a cost, and that survival is the ultimate measure of skill, strategy, and human resilience.